Chapter 4 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 4. Sexual Inversion in Women, Part 1. Homosexuality is not less common in women than in men. In the seriocomic theory of sex set forth by Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium, males and females are placed on a footing of complete equality, and, however fantastic, the theory suffices to indicate that to the Greek mind, so familiar with homosexuality, its manifestations seem just as likely to occur in women as in men. That is undoubtedly the case. Like other anomalies, indeed, in its more pronounced forms it may be less frequently met with in women. In its less pronounced forms, almost certainly, it is more frequently found. A Catholic confessor, a friend tells me, informed him that for one man who acknowledges homosexual practices, there are 3 women. For the most part, feminine homosexuality runs everywhere a parallel course to masculine homosexuality, and is found under the same conditions. It is as common in girls as in boys. It has been found, under certain conditions, to abound among women in colleges and convents and prisons, as well as under the ordinary conditions of society. Perhaps the earliest case of homosexuality recorded in detail occurred in a woman, and it was with the investigation of such a case in a woman that Westphal may be said to have inaugurated the scientific study of inversion. Moreover, inversion is as likely to be accompanied by high intellectual ability in a woman as in a man. The importance of a clear conception of inversion is indeed in some respects, under present social conditions, really even greater in the case of women than of men. For if, as has sometimes been said of our civilization, this is a man's world, the large proportion of able women inverts, whose masculine qualities render it comparatively easy for them to adopt masculine avocations, becomes a highly significant fact. It has been noted of distinguished women in all ages and in all fields of activity that they have frequently displayed some masculine traits. Even the first great woman in history, as she has been called by a historian of Egypt, Queen Hatshepsut, was clearly of markedly virile temperament, and always had herself represented on her monuments in masculine costume, and even with a false beard. Other famous queens have on more or less satisfactory grounds been suspected of a homosexual temperament, such as Catherine II of Russia, who appears to have been bisexual, and Queen Christina of Sweden, whose very marked masculine traits and high intelligence seem to have been combined with a definitely homosexual or bisexual temperament. Great religious and moral leaders like Madame Blavatsky and Louise Michel have been either homosexual or bisexual, or at least of pronounced masculine temperament. Great actresses from the 18th century onward have frequently been more or less correctly identified with homosexuality, as also many women distinguished in other arts. Above all, Sappho, the greatest of women poets, the peer of the greatest poets of the other sex in the supreme power of uniting art and passion, has left a name which is permanently associated with homosexuality. It can scarcely be said that opinion is unanimous in regard to Sappho, and the reliable information about her, outside the evidence of the fragments of her poems which have reached us, is scanty. Her fame has always been great. In classic times her name was coupled with Homer's, but even to antiquity she was somewhat of an enigma, and many legends grew up around her name, such as the familiar story that she threw herself into the sea for the love of Phaon. What remains clear is that she was regarded with great respect and admiration by her contemporaries, that she was of aristocratic family, that she was probably married and had a daughter, that at one time she had to take her part in political exile, and that she addressed her girl friends in precisely similar terms to those addressed by Alcaeus to youths. We know that in antiquity feminine homosexuality was regarded as especially common in Sparta, Lesbos, and Miletus. Horace, who was able to read Sappho's complete poems, states that the objects of her love plaints were the young girls of Lesbos, while Ovid, who played so considerable a part in weaving fantastic stories round Sappho's name, never claimed that he had any basis of truth. It was inevitable that the early Christians should eagerly attack so ambiguous a figure, and Tatian (Oratio ad Grecos, chapter 52) reproached the Greeks that they honored statues of the tribade Sappho, a prostitute who had celebrated her own wantonness and infatuation. The result is that in modern times there have been some who placed Sappho's character in a very bad light, and others who have gone to the opposite extreme in an attempt at rehabilitation. Thus W. Muir, in his History of the Language and Literature of Ancient Greece (1854), volume 3, pages 272 to 326 and 496 to 498, dealing very fully with Sappho, is disposed to accept many of the worst stories about her, though he has no pronounced animus, and, as regards female homosexuality, which he considers to be far more venial than male homosexuality, he remarks that "in modern times it has numbered among its votaries females distinguished for refinement of manners and elegant accomplishments." Bascoul, on the other hand, will accept no statements about Sappho which conflict with modern ideals of complete respectability, and even seeks to rewrite her most famous ode in accordance with the colourless literary sense which he supposes that it originally bore. J.M.F. Bascoul, La chaste Sappho et le mouvement féministe à Athènes, 1911. Wilamowitz-Moellendorff, Sappho und Simonides, 1913, also represents the antiquated view, formerly championed by Welcker, according to which the attribution of homosexuality is a charge of vice to be repudiated with indignation. Most competent and reliable authorities today, however, while rejecting the accretions of legend around Sappho's name, and not disputing her claim to respect, are not disposed to question the personal and homosexual character of her poems. "All ancient tradition and the character of her extant fragments," says Professor J.A. Platt (Encyclopaedia Britannica, 11th edition, article Sappho), "show that her morality was what has ever since been known as lesbian." What exactly that lesbian morality involved we cannot indeed exactly ascertain. "It is altogether idle," as A. Croissin remarks of Sappho (Histoire de la littérature grecque, volume 2, chapter 5), "to discuss the exact quality of this friendship or this love, or to seek to determine with precision the frontiers which language itself often seems to seek to confuse, of a friendship more or less aesthetic and sensual, of a love more or less platonic." See also J. M. Edmonds, Sappho in the Added Lights of the New Fragments, 1912. Ivan Bloch similarly concludes (Ursprung der Syphilis, volume 2, 1911, page 507) that Sappho probably combined, as modern investigation shows to be easily possible, lofty ideal feelings with passionate sensuality, exactly as happens in normal love. It must also be said that in literature homosexuality in women has furnished a much more frequent motive to the artist than homosexuality in men. Among the Greeks, indeed, homosexuality in women seldom received literary consecration, and in the revival of the classical spirit at the Renaissance it was still chiefly in male adolescents, as we see, for instance, in Marino's Adone, that the homosexual ideal found expression. After that date, male inversion was for a long period rarely touched in literature, save briefly and satirically, while inversion in women becomes a subject which might be treated in detail, and even with complacence. Many poets and novelists, especially in France, might be cited in evidence. Ariosto, it has been pointed out, has described the homosexual attractions of women. Diderot's famous novel La Religieuse, which, when first published, was thought to have been actually written by a nun, deals with the torture to which a nun was put by the perverse lubricity of her abbess, for whom, it is said, Diderot found a model in the Abbess of Chelles, a daughter of the Regent and thus a member of a family which for several generations showed a marked tendency to inversion. Diderot's narrative has been described as a faithful description of the homosexual phenomena liable to occur in convents. Feminine homosexuality, especially in convents, was often touched on less seriously in the 18th century. Thus we find a homosexual scene in Les Plaisirs du Cloître, a play written in 1773, Le Théâtre d'amour en 18 siècle, 1910. Balzac, who treated so many psychological aspects of love in a more or less veiled manner, has touched on this in La Fille aux Yeux d'Or, in a vague and extravagantly romantic fashion. Gautier made the adventures of a woman who is predisposed to homosexuality and slowly realizes the fact, the central motive of his wonderful romance, Mademoiselle de Maupin, 1835. He approached the subject purely as an artist and poet, but his handling of it shows remarkable insight. Gautier based his romance to some extent on the life of Madame Maupin, or as she preferred to call herself, Mademoiselle Maupin, who was born in 1673, her father's name being d'Aubigny, dressed as a man, and became famous as a teacher of fencing, afterward as an opera singer. She was apparently of bisexual temperament, and her devotion to women led her into various adventures. She ultimately entered a convent and died at the age of 34 with a reputation for sanctity. E.C. Clayton, Queens of Song, Volume 1, pages 52 to 61. F. Karsh, Mademoiselle Maupin, Jahrbuch für sexuelle Zwischenstufen, Volume 5, 1903, pages 694 to 706. A still greater writer, Flaubert, in Salammbô, 1862, made his heroine homosexual. Zola has described sexual inversion in Nona and elsewhere. Some 30 years ago, a popular novelist, A. Belleau, published a novel called Mademoiselle Giraud, ma femme, which was much read. The novelist took the attitude of a moralist who is bound to treat frankly, but with all decorous propriety, a subject of increasing social gravity. The story is that of a man whose bride will not allow his approach on account of her own liaison with a female friend continued after marriage. This book appears to have given origin to a large number of novels, some of which touch the question with considerable less affectation of propriety. Among other novelists who have dealt with the matter may be mentioned Guy de Maupassant, La Femme de Paul, Bourget, Crime d'amour, Catel Mendes, Mephistopheles, and Willie in the Claudine series. Among poets who have used the motive of homosexuality in women with more or less boldness may be found Lamartine, Regina, Swinburne, first series of poems and ballads, Verlaine, Parallèlement, and Pierre Louis, Chansons de Bellity. The last named book, a collection of homosexual prose poems, attracted considerable attention on publication, as it was an attempt at mystification, being put forward as a translation of the poems of a newly discovered Oriental Greek poetess. Biliti, more usually Belti, is the Syrian name for Aphrodite. Les Chansons de Biliti are not without charm, but have been severely dealt with by Wilamowicz Müllendorf, Sappho and Simonides, 1913, page 63 and further, as a travesty of Hellenism, betraying inadequate knowledge of Greek antiquity. More interesting, as the work of a woman who was not only highly gifted, but herself of homosexual temperament, are the various volumes of poems published by Renée Vivien. This lady, whose real name was Pauline Tarn, was born in 1877. Her father was of Scotch descent, and her mother an American lady from Honolulu. As a child she was taken to Paris, and was brought up as a French girl. She traveled much, and at one time took a house at Mytilene, the chief city of ancient Lesbos. She had a love of solitude, hated publicity, and was devoted to her women friends, especially to one whose early death about 1900 was the great sorrow of Pauline Tarn's life. She is described as very beautiful, very simple and sweet-natured, and highly accomplished in many directions. She suffered, however, from nervous overtension and incurable melancholy. Toward the close of her life she was converted to Catholicism and died in 1909 at the age of 32. She is buried in the cemetery at Passy. Her best verse is by some considered among the finest in the French language. Charles Brun, Pauline Tarn, Notes and Queries, 22nd August 1914. The same writer who knew her well has also written a pamphlet, Renée Vivien, Saint-Saul, Paris 1911. Her chief volumes of poems are Études et Préludes, 1901, Cendres et Poussières, 1902, Evocations, 1903. A novel, Une femme m'apparut, 1904, is said to be to some extent autobiographical. Renée Vivien also wrote a volume on Sappho with translations, and a further volume of poems, Les Kytharèdes, suggested by the fragments which remain of the minor women poets of Greece, followers of Sappho. It is, moreover, noteworthy that a remarkably large proportion of the cases in which homosexuality has led to crimes of violence, or otherwise come under medico-legal observation, has been among women. It is well known that the part taken by women generally in open criminality, and especially in crimes of violence, is small as compared with men. In the homosexual field, as we might have anticipated, the conditions are to some extent reversed. Inverted men, in whom a more or less feminine temperament is so often found, are rarely impelled to acts of aggressive violence, though they frequently commit suicide. Inverted women, who may retain their feminine emotionality combined with some degree of infantile impulsiveness and masculine energy, present a favorable soil for the seeds of passional crime, under those conditions of jealousy and allied emotions which must so often enter into the invert's life. The first conspicuous example of this tendency in recent times is the Memphis Case, 1892, in the United States. Arthur MacDonald, Observation de sexualité pathologique féminine, Archive d'anthropologie criminelle, May 1895. See also Krafft-Ebing, Psychopathia sexualis, English translation of 10th edition, page 550. In this case, a congenital sexual invert, Alice Mitchell, planned a marriage with Frida Ward, taking a male name and costume. This scheme was frustrated by Frida's sister, and Alice Mitchell then cut Frida's throat. There is no reason to suppose that she was insane at the time of the murder. She was a typical invert of a very pronounced kind. Her mother had been insane and had homicidal impulses. She herself was considered unbalanced and was masculine in her habits from her earliest years. Her face was obviously unsymmetrical, and she had an appearance of youthfulness below her age. She was not vicious and had little knowledge of sexual matters, but when she kissed Frida she was ashamed of being seen, while Frida could see no reason for being ashamed. She was adjudged insane. There have been numerous cases in America more recently. One case, for some details concerning which I am indebted to Dr. J.G. Kernan of Chicago, is that of the Tiller sisters, two quintroons who for many years had acted together under that name in cheap theaters. One, who was an invert with a horror of men dating from early girlhood, was sexually attached to the other, who was without inborn inversion, and was eventually induced by a man to leave the invert. The latter, overcome by jealousy, broke into the apartment of the couple and shot the man dead. She was tried and sent to prison for life. A defense of insanity was made, but for this there was no evidence. In another case, also occurring in Chicago, reported in Medicine, June 1899, and Alienist and Neurologist, October 1899, a trained nurse lived for 14 years with a young woman who left her on 4 different occasions, but was each time induced to return. Finally, however, she left and married, whereupon the nurse shot the husband, who was not, however, fatally wounded. The culprit in this case had been twice married, but had not lived with either of her husbands. It was stated that her mother had died in an asylum, and that her brother had committed suicide. She was charged with disorderly conduct, and subjected to a fine. In another later case in Chicago, a Russian girl of 22 named Anna Rubinovich shot from motives of jealousy another Russian girl to whom she had been devoted from childhood, and then fatally shot herself. The relations between the two girls had been very intimate. "Our love affair is one purely of the soul," Anna Rubinovich was accustomed to say. "We love each other on a higher plane than that of earth." I am informed that there were in fact physical relationships. The sexual organs were normal. This continued with great devotion on each side until Anna's sweetheart began to show herself susceptible to the advances of a male wooer. This aroused uncontrollable jealousy in Anna, whose father, it may be noted, had committed suicide by shooting some years previously. Homosexual relationships are also a cause of suicide among women. Such a case was reported in Massachusetts early in 1901. A girl of 21 had been tended during a period of nervous prostration, apparently of a hysterical nature, by a friend and neighbor 14 years her senior, married and having children. An intimate friendship grew up, equally ardent on both sides. The mother of the younger woman and the husband of the other took measures to put a stop to the intimacy, and the girl was sent away to a distant city. Stolen interviews, however, still occurred. Finally, when the obstacles became insurmountable, the younger woman bought a revolver and deliberately shot herself in the temple in presence of her mother, dying immediately. Though sometimes thought to act rather strangely, she was a great favorite with all, handsome, very athletic, fond of all outdoor sports, an energetic religious worker, possessing a fine voice, and was an active member of many clubs and societies. The older woman belonged to an aristocratic family and was loved and respected by all. In another case in New York in 1905, a retired sailor, Captain John Weed, who had commanded transatlantic vessels for many years, was admitted to a home for old sailors, and shortly after became ill and despondent and cut his throat. It was then found that Captain Weed was really a woman. I am informed that the old sailor's despondency and suicide were due to enforced separation from a female companion. The infatuation of young girls for actresses and other prominent women may occasionally lead to suicide. Thus in Philadelphia, a few years ago, a girl of 19, belonging to a very wealthy family, beautiful and highly educated, acquired an absorbing infatuation for Miss Mary Garden, the prima donna, with whom she had no personal acquaintance. The young girl would kneel in worship before the singer's portrait, and studied hairdressing and manicuring in the hope of becoming Miss Garden's maid. When she realized that her dream was hopeless, she shot herself with a revolver. Cases more or less resembling those here brought forward occur from time to time in all parts of the civilized world. Reports, mostly from current newspapers, of such cases, as well as of simple transvestism or eonism in both women and men, will be found in the publications of the Berlin Wissenschaftlich-Humanitären Komitee, the Monatsberichte, up to 1909, then in the Vierteljahresberichte, and from 1913 onward in the Jahrbuch für sexuelle Zwischenstufen. Yet, until recently, comparatively little has been known of sexual inversion in women. Even so lately as 1901, after the publication of the first edition of the present study, Krafft-Ebing wrote that scarcely 50 cases had been recorded. The chief monographs devoted but little space to women. Krafft-Ebing himself, in the earlier editions of Psychopathia Sexualis, gave little special attention to inversion in women, although he published a few cases. Moll, however, included a valuable chapter on the subject in his Konträre Sexualempfindung, narrating numerous cases, and inversion in women also received special attention in the present study. Hirschfeld, however, in his Homosexualität, 1914, is the first authority who has been able to deal with feminine homosexuality as completely coordinate with masculine homosexuality. The two manifestations, masculine and feminine, are placed on the same basis and treated together throughout the work. It is no doubt not difficult to account for this retardation in the investigation of sexual inversion in women. Notwithstanding the severity with which homosexuality in women has been visited in a few cases, for the most part men seem to have been indifferent toward it, When it has been made a crime or a cause for divorce in men, it has usually been considered as no offense at all in women. Another reason is that it is less easy to detect in women. We are accustomed to a much greater familiarity and intimacy between women than between men, and we are less apt to suspect the existence of any abnormal passion. And, allied with this cause, we have also to bear in mind the extreme ignorance and the extreme reticence of women regarding any abnormal or even normal manifestation of their sexual life. A woman may feel a high degree of sexual attraction for another woman without realizing that her affection is sexual, and when she does realize this, she is nearly always very unwilling to reveal the nature of her intimate experience, even with the adoption of precautions. And although the fact may be present to her that, by helping to reveal the nature of her abnormality, she may be helping to lighten the burden of it on other women. Among the numerous confessions voluntarily sent to Krafft Ebing, there is not one by a woman. There is again the further reason that well-marked and fully developed cases of inversion are probably rarer in women, though a slighter degree may be more common, in harmony with the greater affectability of the feminine organism to slight stimuli, and its lesser liability to serious variation. The same aberrations that are found among men are, however, everywhere found among women. Feminine inversion has sometimes been regarded as a vice of modern refined civilization. Yet it was familiar to the Anglo-Saxons, and Theodore's penitential in the 7th century assigned a penance of 3 years, considerably less than that assigned to men, or for bestiality, to a woman fornicated with a woman. Among the women of savages in all parts of the world homosexuality is found, though it is less frequently recorded than among men. In New Zealand it is stated on the authority of Meurenhout, though I have not been able to find the reference, that the women practiced lesbianism. In South America, where inversion is common among men, we find similar phenomena in women. Among Brazilian tribes, Gandavo wrote, "There are certain women among these Indians who determine to be chaste and know no man. These leave every womanly occupation and imitate the men. They wear their hair the same way as the men. They go to war with them, or hunting, bearing their bows. They continue always in the company of men, and each has a woman who serves her and with whom she lives." This has some analogy with the phenomena seen among North American men. Dr. Holder, who has carefully studied the Beauté, tells me that he has met no corresponding phenomena in women. There is no doubt, however, that homosexuality among women is well known to the American Indians in various regions. Thus the Salish Indians of British Columbia have a myth of an old woman who had intercourse with a young woman by means of a horn used as a penis. In the mythology of the Assiniboine Indians of Canada and Montana, and the Fox Indians of Iowa, there are also legends of feminine homosexuality, supposed to have been derived from the Algonquin Cree Indians, who were closely connected with both. End of Chapter 4, Part 1.
Chapter 4 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock, Ellis. Chapter 4. Sexual Inversion in Women, Part 2. According to the Assiniboine legend, a man's wife fell in love with his sister, and eloped with her, a boneless child being the result of the union. The husband pursued the couple, and killed his wife as well as the child. No one cared to avenge her death. The Fox legend, entitled Two Maidens Who Played the Harlot with Each Other, runs as follows. It is said that once on a time long ago there were two young women who were friends together. It is told that there were also two youths who tried to woo the two maidens, but they were not able even so much as to talk with them. After a while the youths began to suspect something wrong. So once, during the summer, when the two maidens started away to peel off bark, the youths followed, staying just far enough behind to keep them in sight. While the girls were peeling the bark, the youths kept themselves hidden. After a while they no longer heard the sound of the maidens at work, whereupon they began to creep up to where they were. When they drew nigh, behold, the maidens were in the act of taking off their clothes. The first to disrobe flung herself down on the ground and lay there. "Pray, what are these girls going to do?" was the feeling in the hearts of the youths. And to their amazement, the girls began to lie with each other. Thereupon the youths ran to where the girls were. She who was lying on top instantly fell over backward. Her clitoris was standing out and had a queer shape. It was like a turtle's penis. Thereupon the maidens began to plead with the youths. "Oh, don't tell on us," they said. "Truly it is not of our own free desire that we have done this thing. We have done it under the influence of some unknown being." It is said that afterward one of the maidens became big with child. In the course of time she gave birth, and the child was like a soft-shell turtle. In Bali, according to Jacobs, as quoted by Ploss and Bartels, homosexuality is almost as common among women as among men, though it is more secretly exercised. The methods of gratification adopted are either digital or lingual, or else by bringing the parts together. Tribadism. Baumann, who noted inversion among the male Negro population of Zanzibar, finds that it is also not rare among women. Although Oriental manners render it impossible for such women to wear men's clothes openly, they do so in private, and are recognized by other women by their man-like bearing, as also by the fact that women's garments do not suit them. They show a preference for masculine occupations, and seek sexual satisfaction among women who have the same inclinations, or else among normal women who are won over by presents or other means. In addition to tribadism or cunnilingus, they sometimes use an ebony or ivory phallus, with a kind of glans at one end, or sometimes at both ends. In the latter case, it can be used by two women at once, and sometimes it has a hole bored through it by which warm water can be injected. It is regarded as an Arab invention, and is sometimes used by normal women shut up in harems and practically deprived of sexual satisfaction. Among the Arab women, according to Coelho, homosexual practices are rare, though very common among Arab men. In Egypt, however, according to Godard, Coelho, and others, it is almost fashionable, and every woman in the harem has a friend. In Turkey, homosexuality is sometimes said to be rare among women, but it would appear to be found in the harems and women's baths of Turkey, as well as of Islam in general. Bantam in the 16th century referred to the lesbianism of Turkish women at the baths, and Leo Africanus in the same century mentioned the tribadism of Moorish women and the formal organization of tribadic prostitution in Fez. There was an Osmanli Sapphic poetess, Mihiri, whose grave is at Amasia, and Vamberi and Ahistorides agree as to the prevalence of feminine homosexuality in Turkey. Among the Negroes and mulattoes of French Creole countries, according to Corre, homosexuality is very common. "I know a lady of great beauty," he remarks, "a stranger in Guadalupe, and the mother of a family, who is obliged to stay away from the markets and certain shops because of the excessive admiration of mulatto women and negresses, and the impudent invitations which they dare to address to her." He refers to several cases of more or less violent sexual attempts by women on young colored girls of 12 or 14, and observes that such attempts by men on children of their own sex are much rarer. In China, according to Matignon, and in Cochin China, according to Lorion, homosexuality does not appear to be common among women. In India, however, it is probably as prevalent among women as it certainly is among men. In the first edition of this study I quoted the opinion of Dr. Buchanan, the superintendent of the Central Jail of Bengal at Bhagalpur, who informed me that he had never come across a case, and that his head jailer had never heard of such a thing in 25 years' experience. Another officer in the Indian Medical Service assures me, however, that there cannot be the least doubt as to the frequency of homosexuality among women in India, either inside or outside jails. I am indebted to him for the following notes on this point. That homosexual relationships are common enough among Indian women is evidenced by the fact that the Hindustani language has 5 words to denote the tribad: 1. Dugana, 2. Zanake, 3. Sata, 4. Chapatai, and 5. Chapat bars. The modus operandi is generally what Marshall calls geminos committere cunus, but sometimes a phallus called sabura is employed. The act itself is called chapat or chapti, and the Hindustani poets Nazir, Rangin, Jan Saheb treat of lesbian love very extensively and sometimes very crudely. Jan Saheb, a woman poet, sings to the effect that intercourse with a woman by means of a phallus is to be preferred to the satisfaction offered by a male lover. The common euphemism employed when speaking of two tribades who live together is that they live apart. So much for the literary evidence as to the prevalence of what, mirable dictu, Dr. Buchanan's jailer was ignorant of. Now for facts. In the jail of R, the superintendent discovered a number of phalli in the females' enclosures. They were made of clay and sun-dried and bore marks of use. In the jail of S was a woman who, as is usual with tribades in India, wore male attire, and was well known for her sexual proclivities. An examination revealed the following: face much lined, mammae of masculine type, but nipples elongated and readily erectile; gluteal and iliac regions quite of masculine type, as also the thighs; clitoris with enlarged glands, readily erectile; nymphae thickened and enlarged; vulvar orifice patent, for she had in early youth been a prostitute. The voice was almost contralto. Her partner was of low type, but eminently feminine in configuration and manner. In this case I heard that the man went to a local ascetic and begged his intercession with the deity, so that she might impregnate her partner. The Hindu medical works mention the possibility of a woman uniting with another woman in sexual embraces and begetting a boneless fetus. Short History of Aryan Medical Science, page 44. In the town of D there lived apart two women, one a Brahmin, the other a grazier. Their modus operandi was tribadism, as an eye-witness informed me. In S I was called in to treat the widow of a wealthy Mohammedan. I had occasion to examine the pudenda and found what Martino would have called the indelible stigmata of early masturbation and later Sufism. She admitted the impeachment and confessed that she was on the best of terms with her three remarkably well-formed and good-looking handmaidens. This lady said that she began masturbation at an early age, just like all other women, and that Sufism came after the age of puberty. Another Mohammedan woman whom I knew, and who had a very large clitoris, told me that she had been initiated into lesbian love at 12 by a neighbor and had intermittently practiced it ever since. I might also instance two sisters of the Gardner caste, both widows, who lived apart and indulged in simultaneous Sufism. That sometimes the actors in tribadism are most vigorous is shown by the fact that in the central jail of swelling of the vulva was admitted to have been caused by the embraces of two female convicts. The subordinate who told me this mentioned it quite incidentally while relating his experiences as hospital assistant at this jail. When I questioned him, he stated that the woman whom he was called to treat told him that she would never satisfy herself with men, but only with women. He added that tribadism was quite common in the jail. The foregoing sketch may serve to show that homosexual practices certainly, and probably definite sexual inversion, are very widespread among women in very many and various parts of the world, though it is likely that, as among men, there are variations, geographical, racial, national, or social, in the frequency or intensity of its obvious manifestations. Thus in the 18th century Casanova remarked that the women of Provence are specially inclined to lesbianism. In European prisons homosexual practices flourish among the women fully as much, it may probably be said, as among the men. There is indeed some reason for supposing that these phenomena are here sometimes even more decisively marked than among men. This prevalence of homosexuality among women in prison is connected with the close relationship between feminine criminality and prostitution. The frequency of homosexual practices among prostitutes is a fact of some interest and calls for special explanation, for, At the first glance, it seems in opposition to all that we know concerning the exciting causes of homosexuality. Regarding the fact there can be no question. It has been noted by all who are acquainted with the lives of prostitutes, though opinion may differ as to its frequency. In Berlin, Moll was told in well-informed quarters, the proportion of prostitutes with lesbian tendencies is about 25%. This was almost the proportion at Paris many years ago, according to Parent du Châtelet. Today, according to Chevalier, it is larger, and Bourneville believed that 75% of the inmates of the Parisian venereal hospitals have practiced homosexuality. Hammer in Germany has found among 66 prostitutes that 41 were homosexual. Hirschfeld thinks that inverted women are specially prone to become prostitutes. Eulenberg believes, on the other hand, that the conditions of their life favor homosexuality among prostitutes. A homosexual union seems to them higher, purer, more innocent, and more ideal. There is, however, no fundamental contradiction between these two views. They are probably both right. In London, so far as my inquiries extend, homosexuality among prostitutes is very much less prevalent, and in a well-marked form is confined to a comparatively small section. I am indebted to a friend for the following note. From my experience of the Parisian prostitute, I gather that lesbianism in Paris is extremely prevalent. Indeed, one might almost say normal. In particular, most of the Shahou dancers of the Moulin Rouge, Casino de Paris, and the other public balls are notorious for going in couples, and for the most part they prefer not to be separated, even in their most professional moments with the other sex. In London the thing is, naturally, much less obvious, and I think much less prevalent, but it is certainly not infrequent. A certain number of well-known prostitutes are known for their tendencies in this direction, which do not, however, interfere in any marked way with the ordinary details of their profession. I do not personally know of a single prostitute who is exclusively lesbian. I have heard vaguely that there are one or two such anomalies, but I have heard a swell cocotte at the Corinthian announce to the whole room that she was going home with a girl, and no one doubted the statement. Her name indeed was generally coupled with that of a fifth-rate actress. Another woman of the same kind has a little clientele of women who buy her photographs in Burlington Arcade. In the lower ranks of the profession, all this is much less common. One often finds women who have simply never heard of such a thing. They know of it in regard to men, but not in regard to women, and they are, for the most part, quite horrified at the notion, which they consider part and parcel of French beastliness. Of course, almost every girl has her friend, and, when not separately occupied, they often sleep together. But while in separate, rare cases, this undoubtedly means all that it can mean. For the most part, so far as one can judge, it means no more than it would mean among ordinary girls. It is evident that there must be some radical causes for the frequency of homosexuality among prostitutes. One such cause doubtless lies in the character of the prostitute's relations with men. These relations are of a professional character, and as the business element becomes emphasized, the possibility of sexual satisfaction diminishes. At the best also, there lacks the sense of social equality, the feeling of possession, and scope for the exercise of feminine affection and devotion. These the prostitute must usually be forced to find either in a bully or in another woman. Apart from this fact, it must be borne in mind that in a very large number of cases prostitutes show in slight or more marked degree many of the signs of neurotic heredity, and it would not be surprising if they present the germs of homosexuality in an unusually high degree. The life of the prostitute may well develop such latent germs. And so we have an undue tendency to homosexuality, just as we have it among criminals, and to a much less extent among persons of genius and intellect. Homosexuality is specially fostered by those employments which keep women in constant association, not only by day, but often at night also, without the company of men. This is, for instance, the case in convents, and formerly, at all events, however it may be today, homosexuality was held to be very prevalent in convents. This was especially so in the 18th century, when very many young girls, without any religious vocation, were put into convents. The same again is today the case with the female servants in large hotels, among whom homosexual practices have been found very common. Laycock many years ago noted the prevalence of manifestations of this kind, which he regarded as hysterical, among seamstresses, lace-makers, and so on, confined for hours in close contact with one another in heated rooms. The circumstances under which numbers of young women are employed during the day in large shops and factories, and sleep in the establishment, two in a room, or even two in a bed, are favourable to the development of homosexual practices. In England it is seldom that everyone cares to investigate these phenomena, though they certainly exist. They have been more thoroughly studied elsewhere. Thus in Rome, Niceforo, who studied various aspects of the lives of the working classes, succeeded in obtaining much precise information concerning the manners and customs of the young girls in dressmaking and tailoring workrooms. He remarks that few of those who see the virtuous daughters of the people, often not more than 12 years old, walking along the streets with a dressmaker's box under their arm, modestly bent head and virginal air, realize the intense sexual preoccupations often underlying these appearances. In the workrooms, the conversation perpetually revolves around sexual subjects in the absence of the mistress or forewoman, and even in her presence the slang that prevails in the workrooms leads to dialogues with a double meaning. A state of sexual excitement is thus aroused which sometimes relieves itself mentally by psychic onanism, sometimes by some sort of masturbation. One girl admitted to Niceforo that by allowing her thoughts to dwell on the subject while at work, she sometimes produced physical sexual excitement as often as 4 times a day. See also Volume 1 of these studies, Autoerotism. Sometimes, however, a vague kind of homosexuality is produced, the girls, excited by their own thoughts and their conversation, being still further excited by contact with each other. In summer, in one workroom, some of the girls wear no drawers, and they unbutton their bodices, and work with crossed legs, more or less uncovered. In this position the girls draw near and inspect one another. Some boast of their white legs, and then the petticoats are raised altogether for more careful comparison. Many enjoy this inspection of nudity, and experience real sexual pleasure. From midday till 2 p.m., during the hours of greatest heat, when all are in this condition, and the mistress in her chemise, and sometimes with no shame at the worker's presence even without it, falls asleep on the sofa, all the girls, without one exception, masturbate themselves. The heat seems to sharpen their desires and morbidly arouse all their senses. The voluptuous emotions, restrained during the rest of the day, break out with irresistible force. Stimulated by the spectacle of each other's nakedness, some place their legs together, and thus heighten the spasm by the illusion of contact with a man. In this way they reach mutual masturbation. It is noteworthy, however, Niceforo points out, that these couples for mutual masturbation are never lesbian couples. Tripodism is altogether absent from the factories and workrooms. He even believes that it does not exist among girls of the working class. He further describes how, in another workroom, during the hot hours of the day in summer, when no work is done, some of the girls retire into the fitting room, and having fastened their chemises around their legs and thighs with pins, so as to imitate trousers, play at being men and pretend to have intercourse with the others. I have reproduced these details from Niceforo's careful study, because, although they may seem to be trivial at some points, they clearly bring out the very important distinction between a merely temporary homosexuality and true inversion. The amusements of these young girls may not be considered eminently innocent or wholesome, but, on the other hand, they are not radically morbid or vicious. They are strictly, and even consciously, play. They are dominated by the thought that the true sexual ideal is a normal relationship with a man, and they would certainly disappear in the presence of a man. It must be remembered that Niceforo's observations were made among girls who were mostly young. In the large factories where many adult women are employed, the phenomena tend to be rarer, but of much less trivial and playful character. At Wolverhampton, some 40 years ago, the case was reported of a woman in a galvanizing store who, after dinner, indecently assaulted a girl who was a new hand. 2 young women held the victim down, and this seems to show that homosexual vice was here common and recognized. No doubt this case is exceptional in its brutality. It throws, however, a significant light on the conditions prevailing in factories. In Spain, In the large factories where many adult women are employed, especially in the great tobacco factory at Seville, lesbian relationships seem to be not uncommon. Here the women work in an atmosphere which in summer is so hot that they throw off the greater part of their clothing, to such an extent that a bell is rung whenever a visitor is introduced into a workroom in order to warn the workers. Such an environment predisposes to the formation of homosexual relationships. When I was in Spain some years ago, an incident occurred at the Seville Fábrica de Tabacos, which attracted much attention in the newspapers, and, though it was regarded as unusual, it throws light on the life of the workers. One morning, as the women were entering the workroom, and amid the usual scene of animation changing their Manila shawls for the light costume worn during work, one drew out a small clasp knife, and, attacking another, rapidly inflicted 6 or 7 wounds in her face and neck, threatening to kill anyone who approached. Both these cigareras were superior workers, engaged in the most skilled kind of work, and had been at the factory for many years. In appearance they were described as presenting a striking contrast. The aggressor, who was 48 years of age, was of masculine air, tall and thin, with an expression of firm determination on her wrinkled face. The victim, on the other hand, whose age was 30, was plump and good-looking, and of pleasing disposition. The reason at first assigned for the attack on the younger woman was that her mother had insulted the elder woman's son. It appeared, however, that a close friendship had existed between the two women, that latterly the younger woman had formed a friendship with the forewoman of her workroom, and that the elder woman, animated by jealousy, then resolved to murder both. This design was frustrated by the accidental absence of the forewoman that day. End of Chapter 4, Part 2. Chapter 4 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2 by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 4 Sexual Inversion in Women, Part 4. History 34. Miss S., age 38, living in a city of the United States, a businesswoman of fine intelligence, prominent in professional and literary circles. Her general health is good, but she belongs to a family in which there is a marked neuropathic element. She is of rather phlegmatic temperament, well poised, always perfectly calm and self-possessed, rather retiring in disposition, with gentle, dignified bearing. She says she cannot care for men, but that all her life has been glorified and made beautiful by friendship with women, whom she loves as a man loves women. Her character is, however, well disciplined, and her friends are not aware of the nature of her affections. She tries not to give all her love to one person, and endeavours, as she herself expressed it, to use this gift of loving as a stepping stone to high mental and spiritual attainments. She is described by one who has known her for several years as having a high nature and instincts unerringly toward high things. History 35. Miss B., artist, of German ancestry on the paternal side. Among her brothers and sisters, one is of neurotic temperament and another is inverted. She is herself healthy. She has no repugnance to men, and would even like to try marriage if the union were not permanent, but she has seldom felt any sexual attraction to a man. In one exceptional instance early in life, realizing that she was not adapted for heterosexual relationships, she broke off the engagement she had formed. Much later in life, she formed a more permanent relationship with a man of congenial tastes. She is attracted to women of various kinds, though she recognizes that there are some women to whom only men are attracted. Many years since, she had a friend to whom she was very strongly attached, but the physical manifestations do not appear to have become pronounced. After that her thoughts were much occupied by several women to whom she made advances which were not encouraged to pass beyond ordinary friendship. In one case, however, she formed an intimate relationship with a girl somewhat younger than herself, and of very feminine personality, who accepted Miss B.'s ardent love with pleasure, but in a passive manner, and did not consider that the relationship would stand in the way of her marrying, though she would on no account tell her husband. The relationship for the first time aroused Miss B.'s latent sexual emotions. She found sexual satisfaction in kissing and embracing her friend's body, but there appeared to be no orgasm. The relationship made a considerable change in her and rendered her radiant and happy. In her behavior toward men, Miss B. reveals no sexual shyness. Men are not usually attracted to her. There is nothing striking in her appearance. Her person and manners, though careless, are not conspicuously manlike. She is fond of exercise and smokes a good deal. History 36. Miss H., age 30. Among her paternal relatives there is a tendency to eccentricity and to nervous disease. Her grandfather drank. Her father was eccentric and hypochondriacal and suffered from obsessions. Her mother and mother's relatives are entirely healthy and normal in disposition. At the age of 4 she liked to see the nates of a little girl who lived near. When she was about 6, the nursemaid, sitting in the fields, used to play with her own parts, and told her to do likewise, saying it would make a baby come. She occasionally touched herself in consequence, but without producing any effect of any kind. When she was about 8, she used to see various nursemaids uncover the children's sexual parts and show them to each other. She used to think about this when alone, and also about whipping. She never cared to play with dolls, and in her games always took the part of a man. Her first rudimentary sex feelings appeared at the age of 8 or 9, and were associated with dreams of whipping and being whipped, which were most vivid between the ages of 11 and 14, when they died away on the appearance of affection for girls. She menstruated at 12. Her earliest affection, at the age of 13, was for a schoolfellow, a graceful, coquettish girl with long golden hair and blue eyes. Her affection displayed itself in performing all sorts of small services for this girl, in constantly thinking about her, and in feeling deliciously grateful for the smallest return. At the age of 14, she had a similar passion for a girl cousin. She used to look forward with ecstasy to her visits, and especially to the rare occasions when the cousin slept with her. Her excitement was then so great that she could not sleep, but there was no conscious sexual excitement. At the age of 15 or 16, she fell in love with another cousin. Her experiences with this girl were full of delicious sensations. If the cousin only touched her neck, a thrill went through her body, which she now regards as sexual. Again, at 17, she had an overwhelming passionate fascination for a schoolfellow, a pretty, commonplace girl, who she idealized and etherealized to an extravagant extent. This passion was so violent that her health was to some extent impaired, but it was purely unselfish, and there was nothing sexual in it. On leaving school at the age of 19, she met a girl of about the same age as herself, very womanly, but not much attracted to men. This girl became very much attached to her, and sought to gain her love. After some time, Miss H. was attracted by this love, partly from the sense of power it gave her, and an intimate relation grew up. This relation became vaguely physical, Miss H. taking the initiative, but her friend desiring such relations and taking extreme pleasure in them. They used to touch and kiss each other tenderly, especially on the Mons Veneris, with equal ardour. They each experienced a strong pleasurable feeling in doing this, and sexual erotism, but no orgasm, and it does not appear that this ever occurred. Their general behaviour to each other was that of lovers, but they endeavoured, as far as possible, to hide this fact from the world. This relation lasted for several years, and would have continued had not Miss H.'s friend, from religious and moral scruples, put an end to the physical relationship. Miss H. had been very well and happy during this relationship. The interference with it seems to have exerted a disturbing influence, and also to have aroused her sexual desires, though she was still scarcely conscious of their real nature. Soon afterward, another girl of exceedingly voluptuous type made love to Miss H., to which the latter yielded, giving way to her feelings as well as to her love of domination. She was afterward ashamed of this episode, though the physical element in it had remained vague and indefinite. Her remorse was so great that when her friend, repenting her scruples, implored her to let their relationship be on the same footing as of old, Miss H., in her return, resisted every effort to restore the physical relation. She kept to this resolution for some years, and sought to divert her thoughts into intellectual channels. When she again formed an intimate relationship, it was with a congenial friend, and lasted for several years. She has never masturbated. Occasionally, but very rarely, she has had dreams of riding accompanied by pleasurable sexual emotions. She cannot recall any actual experience to suggest this, though fond of riding. She has never had any kind of sexual dreams about a man. Of late years she has occasionally had erotic dreams about women. Her feeling toward men is friendly, but she has never had sexual attraction toward a man. She likes them as good comrades, as men like each other. She enjoys the society of men on account of their intellectual attraction. She is herself very active in social and intellectual work. Her feeling toward marriage has always been one of repugnance. She can, however, imagine a man whom she could love or marry. She is attracted to womanly women, sincere, reserved, pure, but courageous in character. She is not attracted to intellectual women, but at the same time cannot endure silly women. The physical qualities that attract her most are not so much beauty of face as a graceful but not too slender body with beautiful curves. The women she is drawn to are usually somewhat younger than herself. Women are much attracted to her, and without any effort on her part. She likes to take the active part and protecting role with them. She is herself energetic in character and with a somewhat neurotic temperament. She finds sexual satisfaction in tenderly touching, caressing, and kissing the loved one's body. There is no cunnilingus which she regards with abhorrence. She feels more tenderness than passion. There is a high degree of sexual erotism when kissing, but orgasm is rare and is produced by lying on the friend or by the friend lying on her without any special contact. She likes being herself kissed, but not so much as taking the active part. She believes that homosexual love is morally right when it is really part of a person's nature, and provided that the nature of homosexual love is always made plain to the object of such affection. She does not approve of it as a mere makeshift or expression of sensuality in normal women. She has sometimes resisted the sexual expression of her feelings, once for years at a time, but always in vain. The effect on her of loving women is distinctly good, she asserts, both spiritually and physically, while repression leads to morbidity and hysteria. She has suffered much from neurasthenia at various periods, but under appropriate treatment it has slowly diminished. The inverted instinct is too deeply rooted to eradicate, but it is well under control. History 37. Miss M., the daughter of English parents, both musicians, who were both of what is described as intense temperament, and there is a neurotic element in the family, though no history of insanity or alcoholism, and she is herself free from nervous disease. At birth she was very small. In a portrait taken at the age of 4, the nose, mouth, and ears are abnormally large, and she wears a little boy's hat. As a child she did not care for dolls or for pretty clothes, and often wondered why other children found so much pleasure in them. "As far back as my memory goes," she writes, "I cannot recall a time when I was not different from other children. I felt bored when other little girls came to play with me, though I was never rough or boisterous in my sports." Sewing was distasteful to her. Still she cared little more for the pastimes of boys, and found her favourite amusement in reading, especially adventures and fairy tales. She was always quiet, timid, and self-conscious. The instinct first made its appearance in the latter part of her 8th or the first part of her 9th year. She was strongly attracted by the face of a teacher who used to appear at a side window on the second floor of the school building and ring a bell to summon the children to their classes. The teacher's face seemed very beautiful, but sad, and she thought about her continually, though not coming in personal contact with her. A year later, this teacher was married and left the school, and the impression gradually faded away. "There was no consciousness of sex at this time," she wrote, "no knowledge of sexual matters or practices, and the feelings evoked were feelings of pity and compassion and tenderness for a person who seemed to be very sad and very much depressed. It is this quality or combination of qualities which has always made the appeal in my own case. I may go on for years in comparative peace, when something may happen, in spite of my busy practical life, to call it all out." The next feelings were experienced when she was about 11 years of age. A young lady came to visit, a next-door neighbour, and made so profound an impression on the child that she was ridiculed by her playmates for preferring to sit in a dark corner on the lawn, where she might watch this young lady, rather than to play games. Being a sensitive child, after this experience she was careful not to reveal her feelings to anyone. She felt instinctively that in this she was different from others. Her sense of beauty developed early, but there was always an indefinable feeling of melancholy associated with it. The twilight, a dark night when the stars shone brightly. This had a very depressing effect upon her, but possessed a strong attraction nevertheless, and pictures appealed to her. At the age of 12 she fell in love with a schoolmate, 2 years older than herself, who was absorbed in the boys, and never suspected this affection. She wept bitterly because they could not be confirmed at the same time, but feared to appear undignified and sentimental by revealing her feelings. The face of this friend reminded her of one of Dolce's Madonnas, which she loved. Later on, at the age of 16, she loved another friend very dearly and devoted herself to her care. There was a tinge of masculinity among the women of this friend's family, but it is not clear if she can be termed inverted. This was the happiest period of Miss M.'s life. Upon the death of this friend, who had long been in ill health, 8 years afterward, she resolved never to let her heart go out to anyone again. Specific physical gratification plays no part in these relationships. The physical sexual feelings began to assert themselves at puberty, but not in association with her ideal emotions. In that connection, she writes, I would have considered such things a sacrilege. I fought them, and in a measure successfully. The practice of self-indulgence, which might have become a daily habit, was only occasional. Her image evoked at such times drove away such feelings, for which I felt a repugnance, much preferring the romantic ideal feelings. In this way, quite unconscious of the fact that I was at all different from any other person, I contrived to train myself to suppress, or at least to dominate my physical sensations when they arose. That is the reason why friendship and love have always seemed such holy and beautiful things to me. I have never connected the two sets of feelings. I think I am as strongly sexed as anyone, but I am unable to hold a friend in my arms and experience deep comfort and peace without having even a hint of physical sexual feeling. Sexual expression may be quite necessary at certain times, and right under certain conditions, but I am convinced that free expression of affection along sentimental channels will do much to minimize the necessity for it along specifically sexual channels. I have gone 3 months without the physical outlet. The only time I was ever on the verge of nervous prostration was after having suppressed the instinct for 10 months. The other feelings, which I do not consider as sexual feelings at all, so fill my life in every department, love, literature, poetry, music, professional and philanthropic activities, that I am able to let the physical take care of itself. When the physical sensations come, it is usually when I am not thinking of a loved one at all. I could dissipate them by raising my thought to that spiritual friendship. I do not know if this was right and wise. I know it is what occurred. It seems a good thing to practice some sort of inhibition of the senses and acquire this kind of domination. One bad result, however, was that I suffered much at times from the physical sensations, and felt horribly depressed and wretched whenever they seemed to get the better of me. I have been able, she writes, successfully to master the desire for a more perfect and complete expression of my feelings, and I have done so without serious detriment to my health. I love few people, she writes again, but in these instances, when I have permitted my heart to go out to a friend, I have always experienced most exalted feelings, and have been made better by them morally, mentally, and spiritually. Love is with me a religion. With regard to her attitude toward the other sex, she writes, I have never felt a dislike for men, but have good comrades among them. During my childhood, I associated with both girls and boys, enjoying them all, but wondering why the girls cared to flirt with boys. Later in life I have had other friendships with men, some of whom cared for me, much to my regret, for, naturally, I do not care to marry. She is a musician, and herself attributes her nature in part to artistic temperament. She is of good intelligence, and shows remarkable talent for various branches of physical science. She is about 5 feet 4 inches in height, and her features are rather large. The pelvic measurements are normal, and the external sexual organs are fairly normal in most respects, though somewhat small. At a period 10 years subsequent to the date of this history, further examination under anaesthetics by a gynecologist showed no traces of ovary on one side. The general conformation of the body is feminine, but with arms, palms up, extended in front of her, with inner sides of hands touching, she cannot bring the inner sides of forearms together, as nearly every woman can, showing that the feminine angle of arm is lost. She is left-handed, and shows a better development throughout on the left side. She is quiet and dignified, but has many boyish tricks of manner and speech, which seem to be instinctive. She tries to watch herself continually, however, in order to avoid them, affecting feminine ways and feminine interests, but always being conscious of an effort in so doing. Miss M. can see nothing wrong in her feelings, and until at the age of 28 she came across the translation of Krafft Ebing's book, she had no idea that feelings like mine were under the ban of society, as he puts it, or were considered unnatural and depraved. She would like to help to bring light on the subject, and to lift the shadow from other lives. "I emphatically protest," she says, "against the uselessness and the inhumanity of attempts to cure inverts. I am quite sure they have perfect right to live in freedom and happiness as long as they live unselfish lives. One must bear in mind that it is the soul that needs to be satisfied, and not merely the senses." History 38. Miss V., age 35. Throughout early life up to adult age, she was a mystery to herself, and morbidly conscious of some fundamental difference between herself and other people. There was no one she could speak to about this peculiarity. In the effort to conquer it, or to ignore it, she became a hard student, and has attained success in the profession she adopted. A few years ago she came across a book on sexual inversion, which proved to be a complete revelation to her of her own nature, and, by showing her that she was not an anomaly to be regarded with repulsion, brought her comfort and peace. She is willing that her experiences should be published for the sake of other women who may be suffering as in the past she has suffered. I am a teacher in a college for women. I am 34 years old and of medium size. Up to the age of 30 I looked much younger, and since older than my age. Until 21 I had a strikingly childlike appearance. My physique has nothing masculine in it that I am aware of, but I am conscious that my walk is mannish, and I have very frequently been told that I do things such as sewing, just like a man. My voice is quite low, but not coarse. I dislike household work, but am fond of sports, gardening, and so on. When so young that I cannot remember it, I learned to whistle, a practice at which I am still expert. When a young girl, I learned to smoke, and should still enjoy it. Several men have been good friends of mine, but very few suitors. I scarcely ever feel at ease with a man, but women I understand, and can nearly always make my friends. I am of Scotch-Irish descent. My father's family were respectable, prosperous, religious people. My mother's family only semi-respectable, hard livers. Shrewd, but not intelligent. Industrious and money-getting, but fond of drinking and carousing. There were many illegitimates among them. Both grandmothers, though of little education, were unusual women. Of my 4 maternal uncles, 3 drank heavily. When 43, my mother gave birth to me, the youngest of 8 children. Of those who grew to adult years, 2 seem quite normal sexually. One is exceedingly erratic, entirely unprincipled, has been a thief and a forger, is a probable bigamist, and has betrayed several respectable women. Aside from his having inordinate desire, I know of no sexual abnormality. Another brother, married and a father, as a boy was much given to infatuations for men. I fancy this never went beyond infatuation, and of late years has not been noticeable. A third brother, single, though much courted by women on account of his good looks and personal charm, is wholly unresponsive, has no gallantry, nor was ever, to my knowledge, a suitor. He is, however, fond of the society of women, especially those older than he. He has a somewhat effeminate voice and walk. Though he has begun of late years to smoke and drink a little, these habits sit rather oddly upon him. When a child, one of his favourite make-believe games was to pretend that he was a famous woman singer. At school he was always found hanging around the older girls. As a child I loved to stay in the fields, refused to wear a sunbonnet, used to pretend I was a boy, climbed trees, and played ball. I liked to play with dolls, but I did not fondle them or even make them dresses. When my hair was clipped, I was delighted, and made everyone call me John. I used to like to wear a man's broad-brimmed hat and make corncob pipes. I was very fond of my father and tried to imitate him as much as possible. Where animals were concerned, I was entirely fearless. I think I was not a sexually precocious child, though I seem to have always known in a dim way that there were two sexes. Very early I had a sense of shame at having my body exposed. I remember on one occasion I could not be persuaded to undress before a young girl visitor. At that time I must have been about 3. When I was 4, a neighbor who had often petted me took me on his lap and clasped my hands around his penis. Though he was interrupted in a moment, this made a lasting impression on me. I had no physical sensation, nor did I have any conception of the significance of the act. Yet I had a slight feeling of repulsion, and I must have dimly felt that it was wrong, for I did not tell my mother. I was not accustomed to confide in her, for, though truthful, I was secretive. At the age of 5 I commenced to attend a district school. I remember that on my first day I was greatly attracted by a little girl who wore a bright red dress. My first definite knowledge of sex came in this way. I was attending Sabbath school and had become ambitious to read the Bible through. I had gotten as far as the account of the birth of Esau and Jacob, which aroused my curiosity, so I asked my mother the meaning of some word in the passage. She seemed embarrassed and evaded my question. This attitude stimulated my curiosity further, and I reread the chapter until I understood it pretty well. Later I was further enlightened by girl playmates. I fancy I enjoyed listening to their talk and repeating what I knew on account of the mystery and secrecy with which sex subjects are surrounded rather than any sensual delight. I cannot recall any act of mine growing directly from sexual feeling until I was 10 years old. Several other little girls and myself 2 or 3 times exposed private parts of our bodies to each other. In one instance, at least, I was the instigator. This act gave me some pleasure, though no distinct physical sensation. One incident I recall that happened when I was about 10. A girl cousin and myself had been playing house together. I do not recall what immediately led to it, but we began to address each other as boys and tried to urinate through long tubes of some sort. I also recall feeling a vague interest in this process in animals and observing them closely in the act. From this time until I was about 14 I grew ruder, more boisterous, and uncontrollable. Prior to this I had been a quite tractable child. When 12, I became interested in a boy in my grade at school and tried to attract him, but failed. Once, at a children's party, where we were playing kissing games, I tried to get him to kiss me, but he was unresponsive. I do not recall bothering myself about him after that. A year later I had a boy chum, about whom my schoolmaster teased me. I thought this ridiculous. At the age of 13 I menstruated, a fact that caused me shame and anger. Gradually I grew to feel myself peculiar, why I cannot explain. I did not seem to myself to be like other girls of my acquaintance. I adopted as a defense a brusque and defiant air. I spent a good deal of time playing alone in our backyard, where I made a pair of stilts, practiced rope walking, and such things. At school I felt I was not liked by the nicer girls and began to associate with girls whom I now believe were immoral, but whom I then supposed did nothing worse than talk in an obscene manner. I copied their conversation and grew more reckless and uncontrollable. The principal of the high school I was attending, I learned afterward, said I was the hardest pupil to control she had ever had. About this time I read a book where a girl was represented as saying she had a boy's soul in a girl's body. The applicability of this to myself struck me at once, and I read the sentence to my mother, who disgusted me by appearing shocked. During this period I began to fall in love, a practice which clung to me until I was nearly 30 years old. I recall various older women with whom I became much enamored, and one man. Of this there was only one with whom I became acquainted well enough to show any affection. Another was a teacher, and another was a young married woman at whom I used to gaze ardently during an entire church service. Toward all my women teachers I had a somewhat sentimental attitude. They stimulated me, while the men gave me a wholly impersonal feeling. This abnormal sentimentality may have been caused, or at least was increased, by the reading of novels, some of a highly voluptuous nature. I began to read novels at 7, and from 11 to 14 I absorbed a great many undesirable ones. This led to my picturing my future with a lover, fancying myself in romantic scenes and being caressed and embraced. I had always supposed I should marry. When about 5, I decided that when I grew up I would marry a certain young man who used to come to our house. Several years later he married, to my real disappointment. I had no affection for him, but merely thought he would make a desirable husband. During my unhappy adolescence, I heard that a former playmate was going to visit at my home. I began to look forward to the visit with much eagerness, and at her arrival was much excited. I wished to stay alone with her and to caress her, and when we slept together, I pressed my body against her in a sensual manner, which act she permitted, but without passion. I was greatly excited and could scarcely sleep. This was the first time I had acted in such a way, and after she left I felt shame and dislike for her. At future meetings there was never the least sensuality. We never refer to the first visit, and are still friends, though not intimate. A diary which I kept during my 14th and 15th years is filled with romantic sentiments and endearing terms applied successively to 3 girls of my own age. I had but a speaking acquaintance with them, but I was strongly infatuated with all. One boy was also the object of adoration. During my 13th year I became for a time very religious and devoted to religious exercises. This passed, and by my 14th year I had become heretical, but was still keenly sensitive to religious influences. When barely 16, I slept one night with a woman of low morals. She acted toward me in a sensual manner and aroused my sexual feelings. I felt at the time that this was a sin, but I was carried away by passion. Afterward I hated this woman and despised myself. I then went away to a co-educational boarding school. Here, for the first time, I became happy. A girl of my own age, of fine character and noticeable refinement, fell in love with me and caused me to reciprocate. On retrospection, I believe this to have been a genuine and beautiful love on both sides. After a few months, however, our relation, at my initiative and against my friend's will, became a physical one. We expressed our affection by mutual caresses, close embraces, and lying on each other's bodies. I sometimes touched her sexual organs sensually. All this contact gave me exquisite thrills. After 3 years we had a misunderstanding and separated. I was greatly grieved and troubled for many years, and came to regret greatly the physical relationship that had existed between us. My friend at length fell in love and married. I had several other slighter infatuations for women, was courted by several men to whom I remained cold and bored, except in one instance where I was somewhat touched, and finally found elastic friendship with a woman who had fallen deeply in love with me in her school days and had never been able to care for anyone else. She is a woman of considerable literary talent and of good general ability and high ideals. She is usually much liked by men. Her love for me is the most real thing in the world for me, and seems the most permanent. At first my feeling for her was almost purely physical, although there were no sexual relations. I hated this feeling and have succeeded in overcoming it pretty largely. At times, after long separations, we have embraced with great passion, at least on my part. This has always had a bad physical effect on me. At present, however, it very rarely occurs. We both consider sexual feelings degrading and deleterious of real love. Whether at any time we have had complete physical satisfaction or gratification, I hardly know. I have experienced very keen physical pleasure, mingled with what I took to be great mental exaltation and quickening of the emotions. This condition was brought about by close contact with the body of my friend, usually by lying upon it. But if by gratification it is meant that desire, having been completely satisfied, ceases temporarily, I think I have never had that experience. If I did, it was when I was about 18, when I lived with a girl friend in intimate relations. Of late years, at any rate, it has never happened to me, and an embrace, however close, always leaves me with a desire for a closer union, both physical and spiritual. So, a few years since, I came to the conclusion that it was impossible to obtain physical satisfaction through the woman I loved. I came to this conclusion because of the bad physical effects of contact. My sexual organs became highly sensitive and inflamed, and I suffered pain from the inflammation and resulting leucorrhea. Should I allow myself to indulge in caresses, this condition would return. My friend fortunately, though very affectionate and demonstrative toward me, has very little sexual passion. The idea that our relationship is based upon it is very repugnant to her. I was at one time, a few years since, much discouraged and almost hopeless of being able to overcome my appetite, and I decided that we could not associate unless I succeeded. At present, with help, I have very largely succeeded in living with my friend on a basis of normal, though affectionate and tender, companionship. I have been helped more and have learned more through this companionship than through anything else. The keen pleasure that I have felt when in responsive contact I never experienced in masturbation. So far as I remember, it never took place till I was well along in my teens, and was never an habitual practice except the first summer I was separated from a school friend whom I loved. Thoughts of her aroused feelings which I attempted to satisfy in this way, but the entire sensuality of the act soon led me to refrain and to see that that was not what I wanted. A peculiar incident that might have some significance occurred to me about 5 years ago. I was sitting in a small room where a seminar was being conducted. The leader of the discussion was a man about 50, whom I looked up to on account of his attainments and respected as a man, though I knew him socially very slightly. I had lost a night's sleep from toothache and was feeling nervous. I was giving my entire attention to the subject in hand, when suddenly I felt a very strong physical compulsion toward that man. I did not know what I was going to do, but I felt on the point of losing all control of myself. I was afraid to leave for fear the slightest movement would throw me into a panic. The attraction was entirely physical and like nothing I had felt before, and I had a strange feeling that its cause was in the man himself, that he was willing it. I was like a spectator. It was some moments before the assemblage broke up, when my possession completely disappeared and never recurred. Regarding dreams, I will say that not until the past year or two have I been conscious of having clear-cut dreams with definite happenings. They seemed usually to leave only vague impressions, such as a feeling that I had been riding horseback or trying to perform some hard task. Sexual dreams I do not recall having had for several years, except that occasionally I am awakened by a feeling of uncomfortable sexual desire which seems usually caused by a need to urinate. Between the ages of 17 and 22 approximately, I frequently, perhaps several times a month, would have vague sexual dreams. These always, I think, occurred when I happened to be sleeping with someone whom, in my dream, I would mistake for my intimate friend, and would awaken myself by embracing my bedfellow with sometimes a slight, sometimes considerable degree of passion. I have finally arrived at some understanding of my own temperament, and am no longer miserable and melancholy. I regret that I am not a man, because I could then have a home and children. End of chapter 4, part 4.
Chapter 4 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Meilinger. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 4 Sexual Inversion in Women, Part 3. In theaters, the abnormal sexuality stimulated by such association in work is complicated by the general tendency for homosexuality to be connected with dramatic aptitude, a point to which I shall have to refer later on. I am indebted to a friend for the following note. Quote, Passionate friendships among girls, from the most innocent to the most elaborate excursions in the direction of Lesbos, are extremely common in theaters, both among actresses and even more among chorus and ballet girls. Here the pell-mell of the dressing rooms, the wait of perhaps 2 hours between the performances, during which all the girls are cooped up, in a state of inaction and of excitement, in a few crowded dressing rooms, afford every opportunity for a growth of this particular kind of sentiment. In most of the theaters there is a little circle of girls, somewhat avoided by the others, or themselves careless of further acquaintanceship, who profess the most unbounded devotion to one another. Most of these girls are equally ready to flirt with the opposite sex, but I know certain ones among them who will scarcely speak to a man, and who are never seen without their particular pal or chum, who, if she gets moved to another theater, will come around and wait for her friend at the stage door. But here again it is but seldom that the experience is carried very far. The fact is that the English girl, especially of the lower and middle classes, whether she has lost her virtue or not, is extremely fettered by conventional notions. Ignorance and habit are two restraining influences from the carrying out of this particular kind of perversion to its logical conclusions. It is, therefore, among the upper ranks, alike of society and of prostitution, that lesbianism is most definitely to be met with, for here we have much greater liberty of action and much greater freedom from prejudices." With girls, as with boys, it is in the school, at the evolution of puberty, that homosexuality usually first shows itself. It may originate in a way mainly peripheral or mainly central. In the first case, two children, perhaps when close to each other in bed, more or less unintentionally generate in each other a certain amount of sexual irritation, which they foster by mutual touching and kissing. This is a spurious kind of homosexuality, and often precocious play of the normal instinct. In the girl who is congenitally predisposed to homosexuality, it will continue and develop. In the majority it will be forgotten as quickly as possible, not without shame, in the presence of the normal object of sexual love. I may quote as fairly typical the following observation supplied by a lady who cannot be called inverted. "Like so many other children and girls, I was first taught self-indulgence by a girl at school, and I passed on my knowledge to one or two others, with one of whom I remember once, when we were just 16, spending the night sensually. We were horribly ashamed after, and that was the only time. When I was only 8, there was a girl of 13 who liked to play with my body, and taught me to play with hers, though I rather disliked doing so. We slept together, and this went on at intervals for 6 months. These things, for the sake of getting enjoyment, and not with any passion, are not uncommon with children, but less common, I think, than people sometimes imagine. I believe I could recall without much difficulty the number of times such things happened with me. In the case I mentioned, when I did for one night feel or try to excite in myself and my girl companion of 16 sensual passion, we had as little children slept together a few times and done these things, and meeting after an absence, just at that age, recalled our childish memories, and were carried away by sexual impulse. But I never felt any peculiar affection or passion for her even at the time, nor she for me. We only felt that our sensual nature was strong at the time, and had betrayed us into something we were ashamed of, and, therefore, we avoided letting ourselves sleep too close after that day. I think we disliked each other, and were revolted whenever we thought of that night, feeling that each had degraded the other and herself." The cases in which the source is mainly central, rather than peripheral, nevertheless merge into the foregoing, with no clear line of demarcation. In such cases a girl forms an ardent attachment for another girl, probably somewhat older than herself, often a schoolfellow, sometimes her schoolmistress, upon whom she will lavish an astonishing amount of affection and devotion. There may or not be any return. Usually the return consists of a gracious acceptance of the affectionate services. The girl who expends this wealth of devotion is surcharged with emotion, but she is often unconscious or ignorant of the sexual impulse, and she seeks for no form of sexual satisfaction. Kissing and the privilege of sleeping with the friend are, however, sought, and at such times it often happens that even the comparatively unresponsive friend feels more or less definite sexual emotion, pudendal turgescence, with secretion of mucus and involuntary twitching of the neighboring muscles. Though little or no attention may be paid to this phenomenon, and in the common ignorance of girls concerning sex matters it may not be understood. In some cases there is an attempt, either instinctive or intentional, to develop the sexual feeling by close embraces and kissing. This rudimentary kind of homosexual relationship is, I believe, more common among girls than among boys, and for this there are several reasons. 1. A boy more often has some acquaintance with sexual phenomena, and would frequently regard such a relationship as unmanly. 2. The girl has a stronger need of affection and self-devotion to another person than a boy has. 3. She has not, under our existing social conditions which compel young women to hold the opposite sex at arm's length, the same opportunities of finding an outlet for her sexual emotions; while 4. Conventional propriety recognizes a considerable degree of physical intimacy between girls, thus at once encouraging and cloaking the manifestations of homosexuality. The ardent attachments which girls in schools and colleges form to each other and to their teachers constitute a subject which is of considerable psychological interest and of no little practical importance. These girlish devotions, on the borderland between friendship and sexual passion, are found in all countries where girls are segregated for educational purposes, and their symptoms are, on the whole, singularly uniform, though they vary in intensity and character to some extent, from time to time and from place to place, sometimes assuming an epidemic form. They have been most carefully studied in Italy, where Obici and Marchesini, an alienist and a psychologist working in conjunction, have analyzed the phenomena with remarkable insight and delicacy, and much wealth of illustrative material. But exactly the same phenomena are everywhere found in English girls' schools, even of the most modern type, and in some of the large American women's colleges they have sometimes become so acute as to cause much anxiety. On the whole, however, it is probable that such manifestations are regarded more indulgently in girls' than in boys' schools, and in view of the fact that the manifestations of affection are normally more pronounced between girls than between boys, this seems reasonable. The headmistress of an English training college writes, "My assumption on such matters has been that affection does naturally belong to the body as well as the mind, and between two women is naturally and innocently expressed by caresses. I have never therefore felt that I ought to warn any girl against the physical element in friendship as such. The test I should probably suggest to them would be the same as one would use for any other relation. Was the friendship helping life as a whole, making them keener, kinder, more industrious, etc., or was it hindering it?" Passionate friendships, of a more or less unconsciously sexual character, are common even outside and beyond school life. It frequently happens that a period during which a young woman falls in love at a distance with some young man of her acquaintance alternates with periods of intimate attachment to a friend of her own sex. No congenital inversion is usually involved. It generally happens, in the end, either that relationship with a man brings the normal impulse into permanent play, or the steadying of the emotions in the stress of practical life leads to a knowledge of the real nature of such feelings and a consequent distaste for them. In some cases, on the other hand, such relationships, especially when formed after school life, are fairly permanent. An energetic emotional woman, not usually beautiful, will perhaps be devoted to another who may have found some rather specialized life work, but who may be very unpractical, and who has probably a very feeble sexual instinct. She is grateful for her friend's devotion, but may not actively reciprocate it. The actual specific sexual phenomena generated in such cases vary greatly. The emotion may be latent or unconscious. It may be all on one side. It is often more or less recognized and shared. Such cases are on the borderland of true sexual inversion, but they cannot be included within its region. Sex in these relationships is scarcely the essential and fundamental element. It is more or less subordinate and parasitic. There is often a semblance of a sex relationship from the marked divergence of the friends in physical and psychic qualities, and the nervous development of one or both the friends is sometimes slightly abnormal. We have to regard such relationships as hypertrophied friendships, the hypertrophy being due to unemployed sexual instinct. The following narrative is written by a lady who holds a responsible educational position. "A friend of mine, 2 or 3 years older than myself (I am 31), and living in the same house with me, has been passing through a very unhappy time. Long nervous strain connected with this has made her sleep badly, and apt to wake in terrible depression about 3 o'clock in the morning. In the early days of our friendship, about 8 months ago, she occasionally at these times took refuge with me. After a while I insisted on her consulting a doctor, who advised her, amongst other things, not to sleep alone. Thenceforth for 2 or 3 months I induced her to share my room. After a week or two she generally shared my bed for a time at the beginning of the night, as it seemed to help her to sleep. Before this, about the second or third time that she came to me in the early morning, I had been surprised and a little frightened to find how pleasant it was to me to have her, and how reluctant I was that she should go away. When we began regularly to sleep in the same room, the physical part of our affection grew rapidly very strong. It is natural for me generally to caress my friends, but I soon could not be alone in a room with this one without wanting to have my arms around her. It would have been intolerable to me to live with her without being able to touch her. We did not discuss it, but it was evident that the desire was even stronger in her than in me. For some time it satisfied us fully to be in bed together. One night, however, when she had had a cruelly trying day, and I wanted to find all ways of comforting her, I bared my breast for her to lie on. Afterward it was clear that neither of us could be satisfied without this. She groped for it like a child, and it excited me much more to feel that than to uncover my breast and arms all together at once. Much of this excitement was sexually localized, and I was haunted in the daytime by images of holding this woman in my arms. I noticed also that my inclination to caress my other women friends was not diminished, but increased. All this disturbed me a good deal. The homosexual practices of which I had read lately struck me as merely nasty. I could not imagine myself tempted to them. At the same time the whole matter was new to me, for I had never wanted anyone even to share my bed before. I had read that sex instinct was mysterious and unexpected, and I felt that I did not know what might come next. I knew only one elder person whom, for wide-mindedness, gentleness, and saintliness, I could bear to consult, and to this person, a middle-aged man, I wrote for advice. He replied by a long letter of the most tender warning. I had better not weaken my influence with my friend, he wrote, by going back suddenly or without her consent, but I was to be wary of going further. There was fire about. I tried to put this into practice by restraining myself constantly in our intercourse, by refraining from caressing her, for instance, when I wanted to caress her, and knew that she wanted it. The only result seemed to be that the desire was more tormenting and constant than ever. If at this point my friend had happened to die or go away, and the incident had come to an end, I should probably have been left nervous in these matters for years to come. I should have faltered in the opinion I always held, that bodily expressions of love between women were as innocent as they were natural, and I might have come nearer than I expected to the doctrine of those convent teachers who forbid their girls to embrace one another for fear an incalculable instinct should carry them to the edge of an abyss. As it was, after a while I said a little on the subject to my friend herself. I had been inclined to think that she might share my anxiety, but she did not share it at all. She said to me that she did not like these thoughts, that she cared for me more than she had ever done for any person except one, now causing most of her unhappiness, and wanted me in all possible ways, and that it would make her sad to feel that I was trying not to want her in one way because I thought it was wrong. On my part, I knew very well how much she did need and want me. I knew that in relations with others she was spending the greatest effort in following a course that I urged on her, and was doing what I thought right in spite of the most painful pressure on her to do wrong, and that she needed all the support and comfort I could give her. It seemed to me, after our conversation, that the right path for me lay not in giving way to fears and scruples, but in giving my friend straightforwardly all the love I could and all the kinds of love I could. I decided to keep my eyes open for danger, but meanwhile to go on. We were living alone together at the time, and thenceforward we did as we liked doing. As soon as we could, we moved to a bed where we could sleep together all night. In the day when no one was there, we sat as close together as we wished, which was very close. We kissed each other as often as we wanted to kiss each other, which was very many times a day. The results of this, as far as I can see, have been wholly good. We love each other warmly, but no temptation to nastiness has ever come, and I cannot see now that it is at all likely to come. With custom, the localized physical excitement has practically disappeared, and I am no longer obsessed by imagined embraces. The spiritual side of our affection seems to have grown steadily stronger and more profitable since the physical side has been allowed to take its natural place." End quote. A class in which homosexuality, while fairly distinct, is only slightly marked, is formed by women to whom the actively inverted woman is most attracted. These women differ in the first place from the normal or average woman, in that they are not repelled or disgusted by lover-like advances from persons of their own sex. They are not usually attractive to the average man, though to this rule there are many exceptions. Their faces may be plain or ill-made, but not seldom they possess good figures, a point which is apt to carry more weight with the inverted woman than beauty of face. Their sexual impulses are seldom well marked, but they are of strongly affectionate nature. On the whole, they are women who are not very robust and well developed, physically or nervously, and who are not well adapted for childbearing, but who still possess many excellent qualities, and they are always womanly. One may perhaps say that they are the pick of the women whom the average man would pass by. No doubt, this is often the reason why they are open to homosexual advances, but I do not think it is the sole reason. So far as they may be said to constitute a class, they seem to possess a genuine though not precisely sexual preference for women over men, and it is this coldness, rather than lack of charm, which often renders men rather indifferent to them. The actively inverted woman usually differs from the woman in the class just mentioned in one fairly essential character, a more or less distinct trace of masculinity. She may not be, and frequently is not, what would be called a mannish woman, for the latter may imitate men on grounds of taste and habit unconnected with sexual perversion, while in the inverted woman the masculine traits are part of an organic instinct which she by no means always wishes to accentuate. The inverted woman's masculine element may, in the least degree, consist only in the fact that she makes advances to the woman to whom she is attracted, and treats all men in a cool, direct manner, which may not exclude comradeship, but which excludes every sexual relationship, whether of passion or merely of coquetry. Usually the inverted woman feels absolute indifference toward men, and not seldom repulsion, and this feeling, as a rule, is instinctively reciprocated by men. At the same time, bisexual women are at least as common as bisexual men. End of Chapter 4, Part 3.
Chapter 4 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 4 Sexual Inversion in Women, Part 5. History 39. Miss D. actively engaged in the practice of her profession, aged 40. Heredity good, nervous system sound, general health on the whole satisfactory. Development feminine, but manner and movement somewhat boyish. Menstruation scanty and painless. Hips normal, nates small. Sexual organs showing some approximation toward infantile type with large labia minora and probably small vagina. Tendency to development of hair on body and especially lower limbs. The narrative is given in her own words. Ever since I can remember anything at all, I could never think of myself as a girl, and I was in perpetual trouble, with this as the real reason. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I began to say to myself that, whatever anyone said, if I was not a boy, at any rate, I was not a girl. This has been my unchanged conviction all through my life. When I was little, nothing ever made me doubt it, in spite of external appearances. I regarded the conformation of my body as a mysterious accident. I could not see why it should have anything to do with the matter. The things that really affected the question were my own likes and dislikes, and the fact that I was not allowed to follow them. I was to like the things which belonged to me as a girl, frocks and toys and games which I did not like at all. I fancy I was more strongly boyish than the ordinary little boy. When I could only crawl, my absorbing interest was hammers and carpet nails. Before I could walk, I begged to be put on horses' backs, so that I seemed to have been born with the love of tools and animals which have never left me. I did not play with dolls, though my little sister did. I was often reproached for not playing her games. I always chose boys' toys, tops and guns and horses. I hated being kept indoors and was always longing to go out. By the time I was 7 it seemed to me that everything I liked was called wrong for a girl. I left off telling my elders what I did like. They confused and wearied me by their talk of boys and girls. I did not believe them, and could hardly imagine that they believed themselves. By the time I was 8 or 9 I used to wonder whether they were dupes or liars or hypocrites, or all three. I never believed or trusted a grown person in consequence. I led my younger brothers in everything. I was not at all a happy little child, and often cried and was made irritable. I was so confused by the talk about boys and girls. I was held up as an evil example to other little girls who virtuously despised me. When I was about 9 years old, I went to a day school and began to have a better time. From 9 to 13 I practically shaped my own life. I learned very little at school and openly hated it, but I read a great deal at home and got plenty of ideas. I lived, however, mainly out of doors, whenever I could get out. I spent all my pocket money on tools, rabbits, pigeons, and many other animals. I became an ardent pigeon catcher, not to say thief, though I did not knowingly steal. My brothers were as devoted to the animals as I was. The men were supposed to look after them, but we alone did so. We absorbed, mated, separated, and bred them with considerable skill. We had no language to express ourselves, but one of our own. We were absolutely innocent and sweetly sympathetic with every beast. I don't think we ever connected their affairs with those of human beings, but as I do not remember the time when I did not know all about the actual facts of sex and reproduction, I presume I learned it all in that way, and life never had any surprises for me in that direction. Though I saw many sights that a child should not have seen while running about wild, I never gave them a thought. All animals, great and small, from rabbits to men, had the same customs, all natural and right. My initiation here was, in my eyes, as nearly perfect as a child's should be. I never asked grown people questions. I thought all those in charge of me coarse and untruthful, and I disliked all ugly things and suggestions. Every half-holiday I went out with the boys from my brother's school. They always liked me to play with them, and though not pleasant-tongued boys, were always civil and polite to me. I organized games and fortifications that they would never have imagined for themselves, led storming parties, and instituted some rather dangerous games of a fighting kind. I taught my brothers to throw stones. Sometimes I led adventures such as breaking into empty houses. I liked being out after dark. In the winter I made and rigged boats and went sailing them, and I went rafting and pole-lipping. I became a very good jumper and climber, could go up a rope, bowl overhand, throw like a boy, and whistle 3 different ways. I collected beetles and butterflies, and went shrimping and learned to fish. I had very little money to spend, but I picked things up, and I made all traps, nets, cages, and so on, myself. I learned from every working man I could get hold of the use of all ordinary carpenter's tools, and how to weld hot iron, pave, lay bricks and turf, and so on. When I was about 11 my parents got more mortified at my behaviour and perpetually threatened me with a boarding school. I was told for months how it would take the nonsense out of me, shape me, turn me into a young lady. My going was finally announced to me as a punishment to me for being what I was. Certainly the horror of going to this school and the cruel and unsympathetic way that I was sent there gave me a shock that I never got over. The only thing that reconciled me to going was my intense indignation with those who sent me. I appealed to be allowed to learn Latin and boys' subjects, but was laughed at. I was so helpless that I knew I could not run away without being caught, or I would have run away anywhere from home and school. I never cried or fretted, but burned with anger and went like a trapped rabbit. In no words can I describe the severity of the nervous shock or the suffering of my first year at school. The school was noted for its severity, and I heard that at one period the elder girls ran away so often that they wore a uniform dress. I knew two who had run away. The teachers in my time were ignorant, self-indulgent women who cared nothing for the girls or their education and made much money out of them. There was a suspicious reformatory atmosphere, and my money was taken from me and my letters read. I was intensely shy. I hated the other girls. There were no refinements anywhere. I had no privacy in my room. which was always overcrowded. We had no hot water, no baths, improper food, and no education. We were not allowed to wear enough clean linen, and for 5 years I never felt clean. I never had one moment to myself, was not allowed to read anything, had even not enough lesson books, was taught nothing to speak of except a little inferior music and drawing. I never got enough exercise, and was always tired and dull, and could not keep my digestion in order. My pride and self-respect were degraded in innumerable ways. I suffered agonies of disgust, and the whole thing was a dreary penal servitude. I did not complain. I made friends with a few of the girls. Some of the older girls were attracted to me. Some talked of men and love affairs to me, but I was not greatly interested. No one ever spoke of any other matters of sex to me or in my hearing, but most of the girls were shy with me and I with them. In about 2 years' time the teachers got to like me and thought me one of their nicest girls. I certainly influenced them and got them to allow the girls more privileges. I lay great stress upon the physical privations and disgust that I felt during these years. The mental starvation was not quite so great because it was impossible for them to crush my mind as they did my body. That it all materially aided to arrest the development of my body, I am certain. It is difficult to estimate sexual influences of which as a child I was practically unaware. I certainly admired the liveliest and cleverest girls, and made friends with them, and disliked the common, lumpy, uneducated type that made 2/3 of my companions. The lively girls liked me, and I made several nice friends whom I have kept ever since. One girl of about 15 took a violent liking for me, and, figuratively speaking, licked the dust from my shoes. I would never take any notice of her. When I was nearly 16, one of my teachers began to notice me and be very kind to me. She was 20 years older than I was. She seemed to pity my loneliness and took me out for walks and sketching, and encouraged me to talk and think. It was the first time in my life that anyone had ever sympathized with me or tried to understand me, and it was a most beautiful thing to me. I felt like an orphan child who had suddenly acquired a mother, and through her I began to feel less antagonistic to grown people and to feel the first respect I had ever felt for what they said. She petted me into a state of comparative docility and made the other teachers like and trust me. My love for her was perfectly pure, and I thought of hers as simply maternal. She never roused the least feeling in me that I can think of as sexual. I liked her to touch me, and she sometimes held me in her arms or let me sit on her lap. At bedtime she used to come and say good night and kiss me upon the mouth. I think now that what she did was injudicious to a degree, and I wish I could believe it was as purely unselfish and kind as it seemed to me then. After I had left school, I wrote to her and visited her during a few years. Once she wrote to me that if I could give her employment, she would come and live with me. Once, when she was ill with neurasthenia, her friends asked me to go to the seaside with her, which I did. Here she behaved in an extraordinary way, becoming violently jealous over me with another elderly friend of mine who was there. I could hardly believe my senses, and was so astonished and disgusted that I never went near her again. She also accused me of not being loyal to her. To this day I have no idea what she meant. She then wrote and asked me what was wrong between us, and I replied that after the words she had had with me my confidence in her was at an end. It gave me no particular pang, as I had by this time outgrown the simple gratitude of my childish days and not replaced it by any stronger feeling. All my life I have had the profoundest repugnance to having any words with other women. I was much less interested in sex matters than other children of my age. I was altogether less precocious, though I knew more, I imagine, than other girls. Nevertheless, by the time I was 15, social matters had begun to interest me greatly. It is difficult to say how this happened, as I was forbidden all books and newspapers, except in my holidays when I had generally a reading orgy, though not the books I needed or wanted. I had abundant opportunities for speculation, but no materials for any profitable thinking. Dreaming was forced upon me. I dreamed fairy tales by night and social dreams by day. In the night dreams, sometimes in the day dreams, I was always the prince or the pirate, rescuing beauty in distress or killing the unworthy. I had one dream which I had dreamed over and over again and enjoyed and still sometimes dream. In this I was always hunting and fighting, often in the dark. There was usually a woman or a princess whom I admired, somewhere in the background, but I have never really seen her. Sometimes I was a stowaway on board ship, or an Indian hunter, or a backwoodsman, making a log cabin for my wife, or rather some companion. My day thoughts were not about the women round about me, or even about the one who was so kind to me. They were almost impersonal. I went on, at any rate, from myself to what I thought the really ideal, and built up a very beautiful vision of solid human friendship in which there was everything that was strong and wholesome on either side, but very little of sex. To imagine this in its fullness, I had to imagine all social, family, and educational conditions vastly different from anything I had come across. From this my thoughts ran largely on social matters. In whatever direction my thoughts ran, I always surveyed them from the point of view of a boy. I was trying to wait patiently till I could escape from slavery and starvation, and trying to keep the open mind I have spoken of, though I never opened a book of poetry, or a novel, or a history, but I slipped naturally back into my non-girl's attitude and read it through my own eyes. All my surface life was a sham, and only through books, which were few, did I ever see the world naturally. A consideration of social matters led me to feel very sorry for women whom I regarded as made by a deliberate process of manufacture into the fools I thought they were, and by the same process that I myself was being made one. I felt more and more that men were to be envied and women pitied. I lay stress on this, for it started in me a deliberate interest in women as women. I began to feel protective and kindly toward women and children, and to excuse women from their responsibility for calamities such as my school career. I never imagined that men required, or would have thanked me for, any sort of sympathy, but it came about in these ways, and without the least help that I can trace, that by the time I was 19 years of age, I was keenly interested in all kinds of questions: pity for downtrodden women, suffrage questions, marriage laws, questions of liberty, freedom of thought, care of the poor, views of nature and man and God. All these things filled my mind to the exclusion of individual men and women. As soon as I left school, I made a headlong plunge into books, where these things were treated. I had the answers to everything to find after a long period of enforced starvation. I had to work for my knowledge. No books or ideas came near me but what I went in search of. Another thing that helped me to take an expansive view of life at this time was my intense love of nature. All birds and animals affected me by their beauty and grace, and I have always kept a profound sympathy with them, as well as some subtle understanding which enables me to tame them, at times remarkably. I not only loved all other creatures, but I believed that men and women were the most beautiful things in the universe, and I would rather look at them unclothed than on any other thing, as my greatest pleasure. I was prepared to like them because they were beautiful. When the time came for me to leave school, I rather dreaded it, chiefly because I dreaded my life at home. I had a great longing at this time to run away and try my fortune anywhere. Possibly if I had been stronger I might have done so. But I was in a very poor health through the physical crushing I had had, and in a very poor spirits through this and my mental repression. I still knew myself a prisoner, and I was bitterly disappointed and ashamed at having no education. I afterward had myself taught arithmetic and other things. The next period of my life, which covered about 6 years, was not less important to my development, and was a time of extreme misery to me. It found me, on leaving school, almost a child. This time, between 18 and 24, should, I think, count as my proper period of puberty, which probably in most children occupies the end years of their school life. It was at this time that I began to make a good many friends of my own and to become aware of physical and sexual attractions. I had never come across any theories on the subject, but I decided that I must belong to a third sex of some kind. I used to wonder if I was like the neuter bees. I knew physical and psychical sex feeling, and yet I seemed to know it quite otherwise from other men and women. I asked myself if I could endure living a woman's life, bearing children and doing my duty by them. I asked myself what hiatus there could be between my bodily structure and my feelings, and also what was the meaning of the strong physical feelings which had me in their grip without choice of my own. Opening bracket. Experience of physical sex sensations first began about 16 in sleep. Masturbation was accidentally discovered at the age of 19, abandoned at 28, and then at 34 deliberately resumed as a method of purely physical relief. Closing bracket. These three things simply would not be reconciled, and I said to myself that I must find a way of living in which there was as little sex of any kind as possible. There was something that I simply lacked, that I never doubted. Curiously enough, I thought that the ultimate explanation might be that there were men's minds in women's bodies, but I was more concerned in finding a way of life than in asking riddles without answers. I thought that one day, when I had money and opportunity, I would dress in men's clothes and go to another country in order that I might be unhampered by sex considerations and conventions. I determined to live an honorable, upright, and simple life. I had no idea at first that homosexual attractions in women existed. Afterward observations on the lower animals put the idea into my head. I made no preparation in my mind for any sexual life, though I thought it would be a dreary business repressing my body all my days. My relations with other women were entirely pure. My attitude toward my sexual physical feelings was one of reserve and repression. And I think the growing conviction of my radical deficiency somewhere would have made intimate affection for anyone, with any demonstration in it, a kind of impropriety for which I had no taste. However, between 21 and 24, other things happened to me. During these few years I saw plenty of men and plenty of women. As regards the men, I liked them very well, but I never thought the man would turn up with whom I should care to live. Several men were very friendly with me, and 3 in particular used to write me letters and give me much of their confidence. I invited 2 of them to visit at my house. All these men talked to me with freedom and even told me about their sexual ideas and doings. One asked me to believe that he was leading a good life. The other 2 owned that they were not. One discussed the question of homosexuality with me. He has never married. I liked one of them a good deal, being attracted by his softness and gentleness and almost feminine voice. It was hoped that I would take to him, and he very cautiously made love to me. I allowed him to kiss me a few times and wrote him a few responsive letters, wondering what I liked in him. Someone then commented on the acquaintance and said marriage, and I woke up to the fact that I did not really want him at all. I think he found the friendship too insipid and was glad to be out of it. All these men were a trifle feminine in characteristics, and 2 played no games. I thought it odd that they should all express admiration for the very boyish qualities in me that other people disliked. A 4th man, something of the same type, told another friend that he always felt surprised at how freely he was able to talk to me, but that he never could feel that I was a woman. 2 of these were brilliantly clever men. 2 were artists. At the same period, or earlier, I made a number of women friends, and of course saw more of them. I chose out some, and some chose me. I think I attracted them as much as, or even more than, they attracted me. I do not quite remember if this was so, though I can say for certain it was so at school. There were 3 or 4 bright, clever young women whom I got to know then, with whom I was great friends. We were interested in books, social theories, politics, art. Sometimes I visited them, or we went on exploring expeditions to many country places or towns. They all in the end either had love affairs or married. I know that in spite of all our free conversations they never talked to me as they did to each other. We were always a little shy with each other, but I got very fond of at least 4 of them. I admired them, and when I was tired and worried I often thought how easily, if I had been a man, I could have married and settled down with one or the other. I used to think it would be delightful to have a woman to work for and take care of. My attraction to these women was very strong, but I don't think they knew it. I seldom even kissed them, but I should often have cheerfully given them a good hugging and kissing if I had thought it a right or proper thing to do. I never wanted them to kiss me half so much as I wanted to kiss them. In these years I felt this with every woman I admired. Occasionally I experienced slight erections when close to other women. I am sure that no deliberate thought of mine caused them, and as I had them at other times too, when I was not expecting them, I think it may have been accidental. What I felt with my mind and what I felt with my body always at this time seemed apart. I cannot accurately describe the interest and attraction that women then were to me. I only know I never felt anything like it for men. All my feelings of desire to do kindnesses, to give presents, to be liked and respected, and all such natural small matters, referred to women, not to men, and at this time, both openly and to myself, I said unhesitatingly that I liked women best. It must be remembered that at this time a dislike for men was being fostered in me by those who wanted me to marry, and this must have counted for more than I now remember. As regards my physical sexual feelings, which were well established during these few years, I don't think I often indulged in any erotic imaginations worth estimating, but so far as I did at all, I always imagined myself as a man loving a woman. I cannot recall ever imagining the opposite, but I seldom imagined anything at all, and I suppose ultimate sex sensations know no sex. But as time went on and my physical and psychical feelings met at any rate in my own mind, I became fully aware of the meaning of love and even of homosexual possibilities. I should probably have thought more of this side of things, except that during this time I was so worried by the difficulty of living in my home under the perpetual friction of comparison with other people. My life was a sham. I was an actor never off the boards. I had to play at being a something I was not from morning till night, and I had no cessation of the long fatigue I had had at school. In addition, I had sex to deal with actively and consciously. Looking back on these 24 years of my life, I only look back on a round of misery. The nervous strain was enormous, and so was the moral strain. Instead of a child, I felt myself, whenever I desired to please anyone else, a performing monkey. My pleasures were stolen, or I was snubbed for taking them. I was not taught, and was called a fool. My hand was against everybody's. How it was that with my high spirits and vivid imagination I did not grow up a moral imbecile, full of perverted instincts, I do not know. I describe myself as a docile child, but I was full of temptations to be otherwise. There were times when I was silent before people, but if I had had a knife in my hand, I could have stuck it into them. If it had been desired to make me a thoroughly perverted being, I can imagine no better way than the attempt to mould me by force into a particular pattern of girl. Looking at my instincts in my first childhood, and my mental confusion over myself, I do not believe the most sympathetic and scientific treatment would have turned me into an average girl, but I see no reason why proper physical conditions should not have induced a better physical development, and that in its turn have led to tastes more approximate to those of the normal woman. That I do not even now desire to be a normal woman is not to the point. Instead of any such help, I suffered during the time that should have been puberty from a profound mental and physical shock which was extended over several years, and in addition I suffered from the outrage of every fine and wholesome feeling I had. These things, by checking my physical development, gave, I am perfectly convinced, a traumatic impetus to my general abnormality, and this was further kept up by demanding of me, at the dawn of my real sexual activity and when still practically a child, an interest in men and marriage which I was no more capable of feeling than any ordinary boy or girl of 15. If you had taken a boy of 13 and given him all my conditions, bound him hand and foot, when you became afraid of him, petted him into docility, and then placed him in the world and, while urging normal sexuality upon him on the one hand, made him disgusted with it on the other, what would have been the probable result? Looking back, I can only say I think the results in my own case were marvellously good, and that I was saved from worse by my own innocence and by the physical backwardness which nature, probably in mercy, bestowed upon me. I find it difficult to sum up the way in which I affect other women and they me. I can only record my conviction that I do affect a large number, whether abnormally or not, I don't know, but I attract them, and it would be easy for some of them to become very fond of me if I gave them a chance. They are also, I am certain, more shy with me than they are with other women. I find it difficult also to sum up their effect on me. I only know that some women attract me, and some tempt me physically, and have done ever since I was about 22 or 23. I know that physically I have always been more interested in women than in men, but have not considered them the best companions or confidants. I feel protective towards them, never feel jealous of them, and hate having differences with them, and I feel always that I am not one of them. If there had been any period in my life when health and temptation and money and opportunity had made homosexual relations easy, I cannot say how I should have resisted. I think that I have never had any such relations, simply because I have in a way been safeguarded from them. For a long time I thought I must do without all actual sexual relations, and acted up to that. If I had thought any relations right and possible, I think I should have striven for heterosexual experiences because of the respect that I had cultivated, indeed I think always had, for the normal and natural. If I had thought it right to indulge any sort of gratification which was within my reach, I think I might probably have chosen the homosexual as being perhaps more satisfying and more convenient. I always wanted love and friendship first. Later, I should have been glad of something to satisfy my sex hunger too, but by that time I could have done without it, or I thought so. At a period rather later than that dealt with in this narrative, the subject of it became strongly attracted to a man who was of somewhat feminine and abnormal disposition, but on consideration she decided that it would not be wise to marry him. End of Chapter 4, Part 5. Chapter 4 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock, ELLIS, Chapter 4, Sexual Inversion in Women, Part 6. The commonest characteristic of the sexually inverted woman is a certain degree of masculinity or boyishness. As I have already pointed out, transvestism in either women or men by no means necessarily involves inversion. In the volume of Women Adventurers, edited by Mrs. Norman for the Adventure series, there is no trace of inversion. In most of these cases, indeed, love for a man was precisely the motive for adopting male garments and manners. Again, Colley Cibber's daughter, Charlotte Charke, a boyish and vivacious woman who spent much of her life in men's clothes, and ultimately wrote a lively volume of memoirs, appears never to have been attracted to women, though women were often attracted to her, believing her to be a man. It is indeed noteworthy that women seem, with special frequency, to fall in love with disguised persons of their own sex. There is, however, a very pronounced tendency among sexually inverted women to adopt male attire when practicable. In such cases, male garments are not usually regarded as desirable chiefly on account of practical convenience, nor even in order to make an impression on other women, but because the wearer feels more at home in them. Thus, Moll mentions the case of a young governess of 16, who, while still unconscious of her sexual perversion, used to find pleasure, when everyone was out of the house, in putting on the clothes of a youth belonging to the family. Cases have been recorded of inverted women who spent the greater part of their lives in men's clothing, and been generally regarded as men. I may cite the case of Lucy Ann Slater, alias the Rev. Joseph Lobdell, recorded by Wise, Alienist and Neurologist, 1883. She was masculine in character, features, and attire. In early life she married and had a child, but had no affection for her husband, who eventually left her. As usual in such cases, her masculine habits appeared in early childhood. She was expert with a rifle, lived the life of a trapper and hunter among the Indians, and was known as the female hunter of Long Eddy. She published a book regarding those experiences. I have not been able to see it, but it is said to be quaint and well written. She regarded herself as practically a man, and became attached to a young woman of good education, who had also been deserted by her husband. The affection was strong and emotional, and of course without deception. It was interrupted by her recognition and imprisonment as a vagabond, but on the petition of her wife she was released. "I may be a woman in one sense," she said, "but I have peculiar organs which make me more a man than a woman." She alluded to an enlarged clitoris, which she could erect, she said, as a turtle protrudes its head, but there was no question of its use in coitus. She was ultimately brought to the asylum with paroxysmal attacks of exaltation and erotomania, without self-abuse apparently, and corresponding periods of depression, and she died with progressive dementia. I may also mention the case, briefly recorded in the Lancet, February 22nd, 1884, of a person called John Coulter, who was employed for 12 years as a labourer by the Belfast Harbour Commissioners, When death resulted from injuries caused in falling downstairs, it was found that this person was a woman. She was 50 years of age and had apparently spent the greater part of her life as a man. When employed in early life as a manservant on a farm, she had married her mistress's daughter. The pair were married for 29 years, but during the last 6 years lived apart, owing to the husband's dissipated habits. No one ever suspected her sex. She was of masculine appearance and good muscular development. The wife took charge of the body and buried it. A more recent case of the same kind is that of Mary Hall, who died in New York in 1801. Her real name was Mary Anderson, and she was born at Govan, in Scotland. Early left an orphan, on the death of her only brother she put on his clothes and went to Edinburgh, working as a man. Her secret was discovered during an illness, and she finally went to America, where she lived as a man for 30 years, making money and becoming somewhat notorious as a Tammany politician, a rather riotous man about town. The secret was not discovered till her death, when it was a complete revelation, even to her adopted daughter. She married twice. The first marriage ended in separation, but the second marriage seems to have been happy, for it lasted 20 years, when the wife died. She associated much with pretty girls, and was very jealous of them. She seems to have been slight and not very masculine in general build, with a squeaky voice, but her ways, attitude, and habits were all essentially masculine. She associated with politicians, drank somewhat to excess, though not heavily, swore a great deal, smoked and chewed tobacco, sang ribald songs, could run, dance, and fight like a man, and had divested herself of every trace of feminine daintiness. She wore clothes that were always rather too large in order to hide her form, baggy trousers, and an overcoat even in summer. She is said to have died of cancer of the breast. I quote from an account which appears to be reliable, contained in the Weekly Scotsman, February 9th, 1901. Another case described in the London papers is that of Catherine Combe, who for 40 years successfully personated a man, and adopted masculine habits generally. She married a lady's maid, with whom she lived for 14 years. Having latterly adopted a life of fraud, her case gained publicity as that of the man-woman. In 1901 the death on board ship was recorded of Miss Caroline Hall of Boston, a water-colour painter who had long resided in Milan. 3 years previously she discarded female dress and lived as husband to a young Italian lady, also an artist, whom she had already known for 7 years. She called herself Mr. Hall, and appeared to be a thoroughly normal young man, able to shoot with a rifle and fond of manly sports. The officers of the ship stated that she smoked and drank heartily, joked with the other male passengers, and was hail fellow well met with everyone. Death was due to advanced tuberculosis of the lungs, hastened by excessive drinking and smoking. Ellen Gledd, alias Ellis Glend, a notorious swindler who came prominently before the public in Chicago during 1905, was another man-woman of large and masculine type. She preferred to dress as a man, and had many love escapades with women. "She can fiddle as well as anyone in the state," said a man who knew her, "can box like a pugilist, and can dance and play cards." In Seville a few years ago, an elderly policeman, who had been in attendance on successive governors of that city for 30 years, was badly injured in a street accident. He was taken to the hospital, and the doctor there discovered that the policeman was a woman. She went by the name of Fernando Mackenzie, and during the whole of her long service no suspicion whatever was aroused as to her sex. She was French by birth, born in Paris in 1836, but her father was English, and her mother was Spanish. She assumed her male disguise when she was a girl, and served her time in the French army, then emigrated to Spain at the age of 35, and contrived to enter the Madrid police force disguised as a man. She married there, and pretended that her wife's child was her own son. She removed to Seville, still serving as a policeman, and was engaged there as cook and orderly at the governor's palace. She served 7 successive governors. In consequence of the discovery of her sex, she has been discharged from the police without the pension due to her. Her wife had died 2 years previously, and Fernando spent all she possessed on the woman's funeral. Mackenzie had a soft voice, a refined face with delicate features, and was neatly dressed in male attire. When asked how she escaped detection so long, she replied that she always lived quietly in her own house with her wife, and did her duty by her employers, so that no one meddled with her. In Chicago, in 1906, Much attention was attracted to the case of Nikolai de Raylan, confidential secretary to the Russian consul, who at death of tuberculosis at the age of 33 was found to be a woman. She was born in Russia and was in many respects very feminine, small and slight in build, but was regarded as a man and even as very manly by both men and women who knew her intimately. She was always very neat in dress, fastidious in regard to shirts and ties, and wore a long-waisted coat to disguise the lines of her figure. She was married twice in America, being divorced by the first wife after a union lasting 10 years on the ground of cruelty and misconduct with chorus girls. The second wife, a chorus girl, who had been previously married and had a child, was devoted to her husband. Both wives were firmly convinced that their husband was a man, and ridiculed the idea that he could be a woman. I am informed that de Raylan wore a very elaborately constructed artificial penis. In her will she made careful arrangements to prevent detection of sex after death, but these were frustrated as she died in a hospital. In St. Louis in 1909 the case was brought forward of a young woman of 22 who had posed as a man for 9 years. Her masculine career began at the age of 13 after the Galveston flood, which swept away all her family. She was saved and left Texas dressed as a boy. She worked in livery stables, in a plough factory, and as a bill poster. At one time she was the adopted son of the family in which she lived, and had no difficulty in deceiving her sisters by adoption as to her sex. On coming to St. Louis in 1902, she made chairs and baskets at the American Rattan Works, associating with fellow workmen on a footing of masculine equality. One day a workman noticed the extreme smallness and dexterity of her hands. "Gee, Bill, you should have been a girl." "How do you know I'm not?" she retorted. In such ways her ready wit and good humour always disarmed suspicion as to her sex. She shunned no difficulties in her work or in her sports, we are told, and never avoided the severest tests. She drank, she swore, she courted girls, she worked as hard as her fellows, and fished and camped. She told stories with the best of them, and she did not flinch when the talk grew strong. She even chewed tobacco. Girls began to fall in love with a good-looking boy at an early period, and she frequently boasted of her feminine conquests. With one girl who worshipped her there was a question of marriage. On account of lack of education she was restricted to manual labour, and she often chose hard work. At one time she became a boiler-maker's apprentice, yielding a hammer and driving in hot rivets. Here she was very popular and became local secretary of the International Brotherhood of Boiler-makers. In physical development she was now somewhat of an athlete. She could outrun any of her friends on a sprint. She could kick higher, play baseball, and throw the ball overhand like a man. And she was fond of football. As a wrestler she could throw most of the club members. The physician who examined her for an insurance policy remarked, "You are a fine specimen of physical manhood, young fellow. Take care of yourself." Finally, in a moment of weakness, she admitted her sex and returned to the garments of womanhood. In London, in 1912, a servant girl of 23 was charged in the Acton Police Court with being disorderly and masquerading, having assumed man's clothes and living with another girl, taller and more handsome than herself, as husband and wife. She had had slight brain trouble as a child, and was very intelligent, with a too active brain. In her spare time she had written stories for magazines. The two girls became attached through doing Christian social work together in their spare time, and resolved to live as husband and wife to prevent any young man from coming forward. The husband became a plumber's mate, and displayed some skills at fisticuffs when at length discovered by the wife's brother. Hence her appearance in the police court. Both girls were sent back to their friends, and situations found for them as day servants. But as they remained devoted to each other, arrangements were made for them to live together. Another case that may be mentioned is that of Cora Anderson, the man-woman of Milwaukee, who posed for 13 years as a man, and during that period lived with 2 women as her wives, without her disguise being penetrated. Her confessions were published in the Day Book of Chicago during May 1914. It would be easy to bring forward other cases. A few instances of marriage between women will be found in the Alienist and Neurologist, November 1902, page 497. In all such cases, more or less, fraud has been exercised. I know of one case, probably unique, in which the ceremony was gone through without any deception on any side. A congenitally inverted Englishwoman of distinguishable intellectual ability, now dead, was attached to the wife of a clergyman who, in full cognizance of all the facts of the case, privately married the two ladies in his own church. When they still retain female garments, these usually show some traits of masculine simplicity, and there is nearly always a disdain for the petty feminine artifices of the toilet. Even when this is not obvious, there are all sorts of instinctive gestures and habits which may suggest to female acquaintances the remark that such a person ought to have been a man. The brusque, energetic movements, the attitude of the arms, the direct speech, the inflections of the voice, the masculine straightforwardness and sense of honor, and especially the attitude toward men, free from any suggestion either of shyness or audacity, will often suggest the underlying psychic abnormality to a keen observer. In the habits, not only is there frequently pronounced taste for smoking cigarettes, often found in quite feminine women, but also a decided taste and toleration for cigars. There is also a dislike and sometimes incapacity for needlework and other domestic occupations, while there is often some capacity for athletics. As regards the general bearing of the inverted woman, in its most marked and undisguised form, I may quote an admirable description by Professor Zuccarelli of Naples of an unmarried middle-class woman of 35. While retaining feminine garments, her bearing is as nearly as possible a man's. She wears her thin hair thrown carelessly back à la Umberto, and fastened in a simple knot at the back of her head. The breasts are little developed, and compressed beneath a high corset. Her gown is narrow without the expansion demanded by fashion. Her straw hat with broad plaits is perhaps adorned by a feather, or she wears a small hat like a boy's. She does not carry an umbrella or sunshade, and walks out alone, refusing the company of men, or she is accompanied by a woman, as she prefers, offering her arm and carrying the other hand at her waist, with the air of a fine gentleman. In a carriage, her bearing is peculiar and unlike that habitual with women. Seated in the middle of the double seat, her knees being crossed or else the legs well separated, with a virile air and careless easy movements, she turns her head in every direction, finding an acquaintance here and there with her eye, saluting men and women with a large gesture of the hand as a businessman would. In conversation her pose is similar. She gesticulates much, is vivacious in speech, with much power of mimicry, and while talking she arches the inner angles of her eyebrow, making vertical wrinkles at the center of her forehead. Her laugh is open and explosive, and uncovers her white rows of teeth. With men she is on terms of careless equality. Inversione congenita dell'istinto sessuale in una donna. L'anomalo. February 1889. The inverted woman, Hirschfeld truly remarks, Die Homosexualität, page 158, is more full of life, of enterprise, of practical energy, more aggressive, more heroic, more apt for adventure than either the heterosexual woman or the homosexual man. Sometimes, he adds, her mannishness may approach reckless brutality, and her courage becomes rashness. This author observes, however, in another place, page 272, that in addition to this group of inverted women with masculine traits, there is another group, not less large, of equally inverted women who are outwardly as thoroughly feminine as are normal women. This is not an observation which I am able to confirm. It appears to me that the great majority of inverted women possess some masculine or boyish traits, even though only as slight as those which may occasionally be revealed by normal women. Extreme femininity, in my observation, is much more likely to be found in bisexual than in homosexual women, just as extreme masculinity is much more likely to be found in bisexual than in homosexual men. End of chapter 4, part 6. Chapter 4 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis, Chapter 4, Sexual Inversion in Women, Part 7. While inverted women frequently, though not always, convey an impression of mannishness or boyishness, there are no invariable anatomical characteristics associated with this impression. There is, for instance, no uniform tendency to a masculine distribution of hair, nor must it be supposed that the presence of a beard in a woman indicates a homosexual tendency. Bearded women, as Hirschfeld remarks, are scarcely ever inverted, and it would seem that the strongest reversal of secondary sexual characters less often accompany homosexuality than slighter modifications of these characters. A faint moustache and other slight manifestations of hypertrichosis also by no means necessarily indicate homosexuality. To some extent it is a matter of race. Thus, in the Pera district of Constantinople, Weisenberg, among nearly 700 women between about 18 and 50 years of age, noted that 10% showed hair on the upper lip. They were most often Armenians, the Greeks coming next. There has been some dispute as to whether, apart from homosexuality, hypertrichosis in a woman can be regarded as an indication of a general masculinity. This is denied by Max Bartels in his elaborate study Über abnorme Behaarung beim Menschen, Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, 1876, page 127, 1881, page 219, and as regards insanity, by L. Harris Liston, Cases of Bearded Women, British Medical Journal, June 2, 1894. On the other hand, J. H. Claiborne, Hypertrichosis in Women, New York Medical Journal, June 13, 1914, believes that hair on the face and body in a woman is a sign of masculinity. Women with hypertrichosis possess masculine traits. There seems to be very little doubt that fully developed bearded women are in most, possibly not all, cases decidedly feminine in all other respects. A typical instance is furnished by Annie Jones, the Esau lady of Virginia. She belonged to a large and entirely normal family, but herself possessed a full beard with thick whiskers and moustache of an entirely masculine type. She also showed short dark hair on arms and hands resembling a man. Apart from this heterogeny, she was entirely normal and feminine. At the age of 26, when examined in Berlin, the hair of the head was very long, the expression of the face entirely feminine, the voice also feminine, the figure elegant, the hands and feet entirely of feminine type, the external and internal genitalia altogether feminine. Annie Jones was married. Max Bartels, who studied Annie Jones and published her portrait, Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, 1891, Heft 3, page 243, remarks that in these respects Annie Jones resembles other bearded women. They marry, have children, and are able to suckle them. A beard in women seems, as Dupré and Duflos believe, Revue Neurologique, August 30, 1901, to be more closely correlated with neuropathy than with masculinity. Comparing 1,000 sane women with 1,000 insane women in Paris, they found an unusual degree of hair or down on the face in 23% of the former and 50% of the latter. But even the sane bearded women frequently belong to neuropathic families. A tendency to slight widely diffused hypertrichosis of the body generally, not localized or highly developed on the face, seems much more likely than a beard to be associated with masculinity, even when it occurs in little girls. Thus, Virchow once presented to the Berlin Anthropological Society a little girl of 5 of this type who also possessed a deep and rough voice. Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, 1891, Heft 4, page 469. A typical example of slight hypertrichosis in a woman associated with general masculine traits is furnished by a description and figure of the body of a woman of 56 in an anatomical institute, furnished by C. Strauch, Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, 1901, Heft 6, page 534. In this case there was a growth of hair around both nipples, and a line of hair extended from the pubes to the navel. Both these two dispositions of hair are very rare in women. In Vienna, among nearly 700 women, Coe only found a tendency to hair distribution toward the navel in about 1%. While the hair in this subject was otherwise fairly normal, there were many approximations to the masculine type in other respects. The muscles were strongly developed, the bones massive, the limbs long, the joints powerful, the hands and feet large, the thorax well developed, the lower jaw massive. There was an absence of feminine curves on the body, and the breasts were scarcely perceptible. At the same time the genital organs were normal, and there had been childbirth. It was further notable that this woman had committed suicide by self-strangulation, a rare method which requires great resolution and strength of will, as at any moment of the process the pressure can be removed. There seems little doubt that inverted women frequently tend to show minor anomalies of the piliferous system, and especially slight hypertrichosis and a masculine distribution of hair. Thus, in a very typical case of inversion in an Italian girl of 19 who dressed as a man and ran away from home, The down on the arms and legs was marked to an unusual extent, and there was very abundant hair in the armpits and on the pubes, with a tendency to the masculine distribution. Of the 3 cases described in this chapter, which I am best acquainted with, one possesses an unusually small amount of hair on the pubes and in the axillae (oligotrichosis terminalis), approximating to the infantile type, while another presents a complex and very rare piliferous heterogeny. There is a marked dark down on the upper lip, the pubic hair is thick, and there is hair on toes and feet and legs to umbilicus. There are also a few hairs around the nipples. A woman physician in the United States, who knows many female inverts similarly, tells me that she has observed the tendency to growth of hair on the legs. If, as is not improbable, inversion is associated with some abnormal balance in the internal secretions, it is not difficult to understand this tendency to piliferous anomalies, and we know that the thyroid secretion, for instance, and much more the testicular and ovarian secretions, have a powerful influence on the hair. Ballantyne, some years ago, in discussing congenital hypertrichosis, Manual of Antenatal Pathology, 1902, pages 321-6, concluded that the theory of arrested development is best supported by the facts. Persistence of lanugo is such an arrest, and hypertrichosis may largely be considered a persistence of lanugo. Such a conclusion is still tenable, though it encounters some difficulties and inconsistencies, and it largely agrees with what we know of the condition as associated with inversion in women. But we are now beginning to see that this arrested development may be definitely associated with anomalies in the internal secretions, and even with special chemical defects in these secretions. Virile strength has always been associated with hair, as the story of Samson bears witness. Ammon found among Baden conscripts, L'Anthropologie, 1896, page 285, that when the men were divided into classes according to the amount of hair on body, the first class with least hair have the smallest circumference of testicles, the fewest number of men with glans penis uncovered, the largest number of infantile voices, the largest proportion of blue eyes and fair hair, the smallest average height, weight, and chest circumference, while in all these respects the men with hairy bodies were at the other extreme. It has been known from antiquity that in men early castration affects the growth of hair. It is now known that in women the presence or absence of the ovary and other glands affects the hair as well as sexual development. Thus Hager, Beiträge zur Geburtshilfe und Gynäkologie, Volume 1, page 111, 1898, described a girl with pelvis of infantile type and uterine malformation who had been unusually hairy on face and body from infancy, with masculine arrangement of hair on pubes and abdomen. Menstruation was scanty, breasts atrophic. The hair was of lanugo type. We see here how in women infantile and masculine characteristics are associated with, and both probably dependent on, defects in the sexual glands. Plant, Central Blatt für Gynäkologie, number 9, 1896, described another girl with very small ovaries, rudimentary uterus, small vagina, and prominent nymphae, in whom menstruation was absent, hair on head long and strong, but hair absent in armpits and scanty on mons veneris. These 2 cases seem inconsistent as regards hair, and we should now wish to know the condition of the other internal glands. The thyroid, for instance, it is now known, controls the hair, as well as do the sexual glands, and the thyroid, as Gautier has shown, Académie de Médecine, July 24, 1900, elaborates arsenic and iodine, which nourish the skin and hair. He found that the administration of sodium cacodylate to young women produced abundant growth of hair on head. Again, the kidneys, and especially the adrenal glands, influence the hair. It has long been known that in girls with congenital renal tumors there is an abnormally early growth of axillary and pubic hair. Goldschwend, Prager Medizinische Wochenschrift, numbers 37 and 38, 1910, has described the case of a woman of 39 with small ovaries and adrenal tumor in whom hair began to grow on chin and cheeks. See also C.T. Ewart, Lancet, May 19, 1915. Once more, the glans hypophysis also affects hair growth, and it has been found by Levy, quoted in Archives d'Anthropologie Criminelle, August-September, 1912, page 711, that the administration of hypophysis extract to an infantile hairless woman of 27 without sexual feeling produced a general tendency to growth of hair. Such facts not only help to explain the anomalies of hair development, but also indicate the direction in which we may find an explanation of the anomalies of the sexual impulse. Apart from the complicated problems presented by the hair, there are genuine approximations to the masculine type. The muscles tend to be everywhere firm, with a comparative absence of soft connective tissue, so that an inverted woman may give an unfeminine impression to the sense of touch. A certain tonicity of the muscles has indeed often been observed in homosexual women. Hirschfeld found that 2/3 of inverted women are more muscular than normal women, while, on the other hand, he found that among inverted men the musculature was often weak. Not only is the tone of the voice often different, but there is reason to suppose that this rests on a basis of anatomical modification. At Moll's suggestion, Flateau examined the larynx in a large number of inverted women, and found in several a very decidedly masculine type of larynx, or an approach to it, especially in cases of distinctly congenital origin. Hirschfeld has confirmed Flateau's observations on this point. It may be added that inverted women are very often good whistlers. Hirschfeld even knows two who are public performers in whistling. It is scarcely necessary to remark that while the old proverb associates whistling in a woman with crowing in a hen, whistling in a woman is no evidence of any general physical or psychic inversion. As regards the sexual organs, it seems possible, so far as my observations go, to speak more definitely of inverted women than of inverted men. In all three of the cases concerning whom I have precise information, among those whose histories are recorded in the present chapter, there is more or less arrested development and infantilism. In one, a somewhat small vagina and prominent nymphae with local sensitiveness are associated with oligotrichosis. In another, the sexual parts are in some respects rather small, while there is no trace of ovary on one side. In the third case, together with hypertrichosis, the nates are small, the nymphae large, the clitoris deeply hooded, the hymen thick, and the vagina probably small. These observations, though few, are significant, and they accord with those of other observers. Krafft-Ebing well described a case which I should be inclined to regard as typical of many. Sexual organs feminine in character, but remaining at the infantile stage of a girl of 10, small clitoris, prominent coxcomb-like nymphae, small vagina scarcely permitting normal intercourse, and very sensitive. Hirschfeld agrees in finding common an approach to the type described by Krafft-Ebing. Atrophic anomalies he regards as more common than hypertrophic, and he refers to thickness of hymen and a tendency to notably small uterus and ovaries. The clitoris is more usually small than large. Women with a large clitoris, as Parent du Châtelet long since remarked, seem rarely to be of masculine type. Notwithstanding these tendencies, however, sexual inversion in a woman is, as a rule, not more obvious than in a man. At the same time, the inverted woman is not usually attractive to men. She herself generally feels the greatest indifference to men, and often cannot understand why a woman should love a man, though she easily understands why a man should love a woman. She shows, therefore, nothing of that sexual shyness and engaging air of weakness and dependence which are an invitation to men. The man who is passionately attracted to an inverted woman is usually of rather a feminine type. For instance, in one case present to my mind, he was of somewhat neurotic heredity, of slight physical development, not sexually attractive to women, and very domesticated in his manner of living. In short, a man who might easily have been passionately attracted to his own sex. While the inverted woman is cold, or at most comradely in her bearing toward men, she may become shy and confused in the presence of attractive persons of her own sex, even unable to undress in their presence, and full of tender ardor for the woman whom she loves. Homosexual passion in women finds more or less complete expression in kissing, slipping together, and close embraces, as in what is sometimes called lying spoons, when one woman lies on her side with her back turned to her friend and embraces her from behind, fitting her thighs into the bend of her companion's legs, so that her mons veneris is in close contact with the other's buttocks, and slight movement then produces mild erethism. One may also lie on the other's body, or there may be mutual masturbation. Mutual contact and friction of the sexual parts seem to be comparatively rare, but it seems to have been common in antiquity, for we owe to it the term tribadism, which is sometimes used as a synonym of feminine homosexuality, and this method is said to be practiced today by the southern Slav women of the Balkans. The extreme gratification in cunnilingus is oral stimulation of the feminine sexual organs, not usually mutual, but practiced by the more active and masculine partner. This act is sometimes termed, by no means satisfactorily, sapphism and lesbianism. An enlarged clitoris is but rarely found in inversion, and plays a very small part in the gratification of feminine homosexuality. Kirner refers to a case occurring in America in which an inverted woman, married and a mother, possessed a clitoris which measured 2½ inches when erect. Casanova described an inverted Swiss woman, otherwise feminine in development, whose clitoris in excitement was longer than his little finger and capable of penetration. The older literature contains many similar cases. In most such cases, however, we are probably concerned with some form of pseudo-hermaphroditism, and the clitoris may more properly be regarded as a penis. There is thus no inversion involved. While the use of the clitoris is rare in homosexuality, the use of an artificial penis is by no means uncommon and very widespread. In several of the modern cases, in which inverted women have married women, such as those of Charlotte Vey and de Raylan, the belief of the wife in the masculinity of the husband has been due to an appliance of this kind used in intercourse. The artificial penis, the olisbos or baubon, was well known to the Greeks and is described by Herodotus. Its invention was ascribed by Suidas to the Milesian women, and Miletus, according to Aristophanes in the Lysistrata, was the chief place of its manufacture. It was still known in medieval times, and in the 12th century Bishop Burchard of Worms speaks of its use as a thing which some women are accustomed to do. In the early 18th century, Margaretha Lincoln, again in Germany, married another woman with the aid of an artificial male organ. The artificial penis is also used by homosexual women in various parts of the world. Thus we find it mentioned in legends of the North American Indians, and it is employed in Zanzibar and Madagascar. The various phenomena of sadism, masochism, and fetishism, which are liable to arise spontaneously or by suggestion in the relationships of normal lovers, as well as of male inverts, may also arise in the same way among inverted women, though probably not often in a very pronounced form. Moll, however, narrates a case, Konträre Sexualempfindung, 1899, pages 565-70, in which various minor but very definite perversions were combined with inversion. A young lady of 26, of good heredity, from the age of 6, had only been attracted to her own sex, and even in childhood had practised mutual cunnilingus. She was extremely intelligent and of generous and good-natured disposition, with various masculine tastes, but on the whole of feminine build and with completely feminine larynx. During 7 years she lived exclusively with one woman. She found complete satisfaction in active cunnilingus. During the course of this relationship various other methods of excitement and gratification arose, it seems for the most part spontaneously. She found much pleasure in urolagnic and coprolagnic practices. In addition to these and similar perversions, the subject liked being bitten, especially in the lobule of the ear, and she was highly excited when whipped by her friend, who should, if possible, be naked at the time. Only the nates must be whipped, and only a birch rod be used, or the effect would not be obtained. These practices would not be possible to her in the absence of extreme intimacy and mutual understanding, and they only took place with the one friend. In this case the perverse phenomena were masochistic rather than sadistic. Many homosexual women, however, display sadistic tendencies in a more or less degree. Thus Dr. Kiernan tells me of an American case, with which he was professionally concerned with Dr. Moyer. See also paper by Kiernan and Moyer in Alienist and Neurologist, May 1907, of a sadistic inverted woman in a small Illinois city, married and with 2 young children. She was of undoubted neuropathic stock, and there was a history of premarital masturbation and bestiality with a dog. She was a prominent club woman in her city, and a leader in religious and social matters. As is often the case with sadists, she was pruriently prudish, and there was strong testimony to her chaste and modest character by clergymen, club women, and local magnates. The victim of her sadistic passion was a girl she had adopted from a home, but whom she half starved. On this girl she inflicted over 300 wounds. Many of these wounds were stabs with forks and scissors, which merely penetrated the skin. This was especially the case with those inflicted on the breasts, labia, and clitoris. During the infliction of these she experienced intense excitement, but this excitement was under control, and when she heard anyone approaching, she instantly desisted. She was found sane and responsible at the time of these actions, but the jury also found that she had since become insane, and she was sent to an insane hospital, after recovery, to serve a sentence of 2 years in prison. The alleged insanity, Dr. Kiernan adds, was of the dubious manic and depressive variety, and perhaps chiefly due to wounded pride. The inverted woman is an enthusiastic admirer of feminine beauty, especially of the statuesque beauty of the body, unlike, in this, the normal woman, whose sexual emotion is but faintly tinged by aesthetic feeling. In her sexual habits we perhaps less often find the degree of promiscuity which is not uncommon among inverted men, and we may perhaps agree with Moll that homosexual women are more often apt to love faithfully and lastingly than homosexual men. Hirschfeld remarks that inverted women are not usually attracted in childhood by the autoerotic and homosexual vices of school life, and nearly all the women whose histories I have recorded in this chapter felt a pronounced repugnance to such manifestations, and cherished lofty ideals of love. Inverted women are not rarely married. Moll, from various confidences which he has received, believes that inverted women have not the same horror of normal coitus as inverted men. This is probably due to the fact that the woman under such circumstances can retain a certain passivity. In other cases there is some degree of bisexuality, although, as among inverted men, the homosexual instinct seems usually to give the greater relief and gratification. It has been stated by many observers, in America, in France, in Germany, and in England, that homosexuality is increasing among women. There are many influences in our civilization today which encourage such manifestations. The modern movement of emancipation, the movement to obtain the same rights and duties as men, the same freedom and responsibility, the same education and the same work, must be regarded as, on the whole, a wholesome and inevitable movement. But it carries with it certain disadvantages. Women are, very justly, coming to look upon knowledge and experience generally as their right, as much as their brother's right. But when this doctrine is applied to the sexual sphere, it finds certain limitations. Intimacies of any kind between young men and young women are as much discouraged socially now as ever they were. As regards higher education, the mere association of the sexes in the lecture room, or the laboratory, or the hospital is discouraged in England and in America. While men are allowed freedom, the sexual field of women is becoming restricted to trivial flirtation with the opposite sex and to intimacy with their own sex. Having been taught independence of men and disdain for the old theory which places women in the moated grange of the home to sigh for a man who never comes, a tendency develops for women to carry this independence still further, and to find love where they find work. These unquestionable influences of modern movements cannot directly cause sexual inversion, but they develop the germs of it, and they probably cause a spurious imitation. This spurious imitation is due to the fact that the congenital anomaly occurs with special tendency in women of high intelligence who, voluntarily or involuntarily, influence others. Corella, Bloch, and others believe that the woman movement has helped to develop homosexuality. See, for example, I. Bloch, Beiträge zur Ätiologie der Psychopathia Sexualis, 1902, Volume 1, page 248. Various feminine stringed birds of the woman movement, as they have been termed, displayed marked hostility to men. Anna Ruhling claims that many leaders of the movement, from the outset until today, have been inverted. Hirschfeld, however, Die Homosexualität, page 400, after giving special attention to the matter, concludes that, alike among English suffragettes and in the German Verein für Frauenstimmrecht, the percentage of inverts is less than 10%. End of chapter 4.